buenos días para los que están aquí en el aula. Buenas tardes para quien luego los vean diferidos. Hasta buenas noches. Good morning, everyone. We are here in panel 4 of the seminar on citizenship, inclusion, the morality and legality of inclusion and exclusion. And we are here in the panel 4, Fringe approaches to citizenship. We have in this panel, we have 3 different papers. The first one by Juan Espíndola, who I understand is a professor and a researcher at Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas, the Legal Philosophical Research Institute, the Philosophical Research Institute here at UNAM. And the second panel is from a paper, the second paper is from González, Fernández, Enrique, Siqueiros, and via Zoom, José Luis Hernández Sánchez. It's worth mentioning that Juan Espíndola is also in Zoom. Karen works as a professor at Universidad Panamericana, as well as Enrique, Siqueiros, and I take, seems that José Luis is only professor in Managua. Thank you. And finally, we'll have a third paper, that's from Michael Blake. Professor Blake is currently at the University of Washington. I have the chance of meeting him long time ago at Harvard University. I would say late 1999, 2000 year, more or less. But well, that's pretty much our panel for today. And so each one of our papers has like 20 minutes for presentation. There's this tendency to say that we only have 15 minutes. So you have 5 minutes to wrap the idea. So you can take 20 minutes, but try to keep it on 15. I will be keeping the time, and I have this, I will call white card with 5 minutes. And I will have to just to point that if we need to really grab, I turn it into the other side, I will have 1 minute. In the Zoom, I'm not sure how I will be probably making like this, but let's figure out what I have to do. Okay. With further ado, we have Juan Espíndola with a paper entitled Mass Surveillance and Mass Atrocity, Facial Recognition in War Context. ¿Estás por ahí, Juan?
Sí, por aquí estoy, gracias. Hi everyone. I just would like to start by thanking all of the organizers of this event, Sandra Gómora, Enrique Camacho, particularly him for telling me there was this opening where I could participate, but also Juan Vega and Imer Flores. So thank you all. And I just want to begin by saying that, as I just mentioned, I'm sort of the pinch hitter here, right? My presentation wasn't originally planned, but somebody apparently canceled, so I got this opportunity. And I just say this because, as you might have seen, if you read the paper, this is pretty much work in progress. As soon as Enrique told me about this, I rushed to finish a paper that's pretty much work in progress. And so you might have seen that if you got the chance to read the paper. And so the first is that this paper is a contribution to a book symposium, which will take place, in a few weeks, on Cecile Fabre's new book called Spying Through a Looking Glass, which is an ethical theory of espionage and counterintelligence. So this contribution is supposed to be a reaction to the book, but also at the same time a self-standing short piece. And I say this because she will appear a lot in the presentation, and she appears a lot in the paper, and that's the reason why this is the case. And so the point of this paper is to react as I said to the book, but also to present sort of a kind of a critique, a constructive critique. And so to do that, let me just begin by saying very briefly what the book, what Cecile Fabre's book is about. So it's, as I said, a theory of espionage, and it rests on 2 foundations. The first one is a rights protection approach. So what she says is that espionage is justified only insofar as it helps protect rights. And then the second foundation, important foundation in the book and the theory is that espionage has to be prevented. So espionage must be understood as self-defensive harm. To the extent that espionage is harmful, it has to be understood as to be justifiable as self-defensive harm. So the point of espionage is to avert threats. What I want to do in this paper is to say that I fully endorse those foundations of Fabre's theory of espionage, but I want to say that there might be a further reason to justify espionage that goes beyond preventing a threat. And that's what I try to do in the paper. And to make that point, I make the case that the war in Ukraine provides helpful illustrations of how espionage can be used in that way. And I also focus in particular in facial recognition techniques when they're used as a form of espionage. And so to start with the war of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, as you might have read in the news, has involved a lot of espionage. Espionage was conducted prior to the invasion, more specifically open source intelligence, which helped Ukraine anticipate the invasion, notwithstanding Russia's protestations that they were not going to invade. And so this the build-up in Ukraine's frontier was revealed by a combination of satellite pictures and also by videos and images from social media platforms, including TikTok, that were coming out of Russia. So there was some espionage going on, as you know. But the one I want to focus on is a kind of espionage that took place during the war, that is taking place during the war, and that involves facial recognition technologies. And just to be on the same page, I just will define very briefly what I understand by facial recognition technologies, which I will call FRT from here forward. And so FRT is a form of artificial intelligence that involves the automated extraction, digitization, and comparison of spatial and geometric distribution of facial features to identify individuals. So that's a very basic definition, and there are many varieties of it depending on its functions, and they go from very basic to very complex. The most basic form of facial recognition is detection, where technology helps to determine whether there is a person there or not. And this kind of technology does not collect personally identifiable information. And then we have more complex forms that do. The two most complex ones are verification, where facial recognition collects or retains personally identifiable facial templates and uses it in a one-to-one matching system. That's basically what your smartphone does when you open it you let the phone scan your face, which is doing a one-to-one matching system. And the whole point is to identify whether the person that's in front of the camera is who the person claims to be. And then we have the most sophisticated one, that's identification, which creates an identifiable template of a unique person and then uses it in a one-to-many matching system. That is, the system creates a template and then compares it to a database with other faces, and the point is to make that match. So that's a kind of facial recognition that's relevant for this purpose of this paper. And so there's this there is a way in which the use of this kind of technology during the war, I'll say a little bit more about it just in a few moments. It can be justified in many ways, and it has been used in many ways. Ukrainian authorities and its allies have used it in several contexts, especially in two: to identify enemy operatives, that is spies and combatants, and to identify fallen soldiers on both sides. One of the companies that's been very at the front of this effort has been Clearview AI, which is a company that's under very intense scrutiny in various parts of the world for committing violation of privacy, and I will also say a little bit about that in what follows. But so one of these uses, so the using FRT to identify operatives, can be justified on the basis of Fabre's theory of espionage. So FRT has been used to identify Russian soldiers who have participated in war crimes. As you read in the news, Russian soldiers have committed murder and have even looted in the occupied territories. And FRT has been used to identify them. They've used footage from surveillance cameras, and they've used FRT to match to try to identify who the perpetrators are. And to the extent that punishment has a deterrent function, it can be argued that FRT here is serving a preventive function, just as and is therefore justified as Faber's theory would claim. FRT could also be used in this context to unveil infiltrators amidst the Ukrainian citizenry, as there have also been news reports that there are infiltrators in many Ukrainian citizens that are posing as Ukrainian citizens and then alerting Russian authorities about potential sites, about potential targets, and just providing intelligence to Russian officials. And so this is an example where FRT could be used. There haven't been any reports that it has actually been used for this purpose, but the idea is that it could be very well, could justifiably be used in this context, and it would be there would be no moral objections to that. But I want to claim, and this is the most important part of the paper, that there are uses of FRT and espionage beyond prevention of threats, and that we have to consider. And one of them is the use of FRT to identify dead combatants. So, as you may know, relatives and friends of fallen soldiers have a right to retrieve their bodies, and belligerent parties have a humanitarian duty to enable this, and as promptly and as effectively as possible to the extent that they can. But during war, authorities or belligerent parties may lack the means or the willingness to promptly identify the bodies of the fallen. FRT can be used to overcome this challenge, and has been used to overcome this challenge. At least that's what we hear from somebody like the Ministry of Digital Transformation. So he's justified the use of FRT and the ulterior dissemination of the images of deceased soldiers over social media as follows. He says, and I'll quote, "This effort is a courtesy to the mothers of those soldiers, of fallen soldiers, to at least let families know that they've lost their sons, and to then enable them to come collect their bodies." Right. So if this claim is sincere, then you could argue that facial recognition technologies are on solid legal and moral grounding. So legally, the Geneva Convention imposes the obligation to respect, and respect is a word that's used, the remains of those who died during an occupation, and to facilitate their return to the home country upon its request or that relatives. And morally speaking, returning the bodies of the deceased allows adequate mourning. And so in that way, it prevents relatives from experiencing what Pauline Boss, a psychologist, has called ambiguous loss, which is a state in which relatives don't know if families don't know if their relatives are dead or not. And this is a psychological condition that is very debilitating mentally. It affects cognitive processes. And to that extent, it undercuts, I would claim, individual capabilities, and capabilities here is in the sense, more or less in the Nussbaum sense. It undercuts their ability to engage in meaningful social relationships and to frame a conception of the good. So my claim would be that if facial recognition technologies can be instrumental in helping individuals overcome this state of ambiguous loss, then it is instrumental in protecting fundamental rights, and it's therefore prima facie justified. Of course, and this is the point I want to underline, this does not involve, this use of FRT does not involve the prevention of a threat, and this is where, again, where I'm trying to engage Cecil Faber's theory, but it does involve the protection of rights. And so I think that's the main point that I want to make. And then just to conclude, I want to consider some objections that might be raised against this use of facial recognition technologies, regardless of whether we justify them along Cecil Faber's lines or if we justify it beyond the prevention of a threat, as I've claimed here that we can. And these are the three objections: the privacy objection, the slippery slope objection, and the humanitarian objection. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around these objections, so they still need work. I don't know if, or I won't go as far as claiming that these objections are clearly or easily defeasible or not. I'm just raising the objections, and I'm still working through them. So the first one is the privacy objection. And this objection would be that since facial recognition technologies must draw on vast amounts of data, images more specifically, which it takes from social media platforms and other internet outlets without the consent of users, then it involves a form of mass surveillance that violates the informational privacy of users. And this, I mean, this is an objection that's usually made usually made against FRT. I mentioned that Clearview AI is under scrutiny in many parts of the world. This is the reason why. But there are also companies that do this, like PMIs and FineClone. And if we go back to the case of Ukraine, then we can see that well, Clearview AI claims to have around 2 billion images from the Russian social media service VKontakte, or I don't know how you pronounce that in Russian. But this platform is essentially Russia's Facebook. And it uses this technology and these databases to identify perpetrators, as I mentioned in just a second ago. And so the objection then is that FRT violates informational privacy, and I agree that we should not minimize the risk that data collection and storage poses for the privacy interest of individuals and societies. There's a recent book by Carissa Bellis that argues very, very strongly in this vein. But I think that the privacy objection to mass surveillance may be defeated in contexts like Ukraine, because, and again here I'm keeping with Faber's theory, states have a duty to detect threats to fundamental rights as early as possible. And this is a duty that is also putative victims, to agents who would be tasked with averting the threat, and even to those who are partially responsible for the threat. And so insofar as, prying on VKontakte, scraping images from the site, contributes to Ukraine's war efforts against a war of aggression, then it is permissible and even mandatory to engage in this kind of defensive counterintelligence. So I don't think that the privacy objection carries much weight here. And also, there's the fact that in a way, we could think that Russian citizens ought to be willing to make some sacrifices to contribute to end this unjust war. And this is just on account of their humanitarian duties. But Russian citizens can also be considered liable to have their informational privacy violated. And this is because, in a way, we could argue that Russian citizens in general, and specifically Russians in these social media platforms, derive some benefits from or make contributions to the invasion, and that is enough to make them liable to experience, intelligence and surveillance. So I don't think that the privacy objection carries a lot of weight again. But then let's turn to the second objection, which is the slippery slope objection, what I call the slippery slope objection. And the idea is, in the case of FRT in war context, there would be the concern that permitting it or encouraging it at this point, even though there are noble purposes to do it, like as I just said, identifying enemy agents or foreign soldiers, this use today might open the door to objectionable goals in the future, such as the deployment of FRT against innocent nationals, the Ukrainians, to conduct unjustified intelligence, or its use by local or transnational non-state actors. And so, as you know, there are fallacious versions of the slippery slope argument, actually, slippery slope arguments are usually fallacious because they don't explain how we get from the unobjectionable or the innocuous scenario today to the danger case in the future. But there are reasonable versions of the slippery slope argument which do explicitly specify a mechanism that could drive slippage from one step to another, from one scenario to another, and that rigorously explain the mechanisms that deserve due consideration. And we could make the case that there is a reasonable slippery slope objection to FRT in the Ukrainian context. And we could point towards two mechanisms. Normalization is the first one. It's the idea that if the technology is used during war, that's going to give it sort of like a reputational boost, so to speak, and that's going to make it, it's going to give it a positive spin, and then that might make it likely that it will be used more intensely in the future because it's accepted by the citizenry. And I don't think that also this objection carries a lot of weight, because citizens tend to know that during war they have to make sacrifices that they would not tolerate under ordinary circumstances. And I think the use of FRT is a good example of that. That I don't think citizens would, just because the technology, just because they accepted the technology in a war context, they would accept it later. And then the other mechanism is the absence of safeguards to curtail potential abuse of FRT. And this is a source of concern, unlike the previous one, because it is true that, or one could argue, if one looks at rule of law indexes and other measurements about Ukraine's institutions, it might be argued that the government doesn't have the institutional qualities, the Ukrainian government, the institutional qualities for potential abuse of intensive use of FRT in the future. So and especially in the context, in a post-war context, in the aftermath of conflict, institutions are very weakened, and with very weak institutions, that it's very hard to control potential abuses of FRT. And then just to conclude, because I think I'm very close to my 20 minutes, I'll just end with the humanitarian warfare objection, which is the idea that FRT is really not and the act of using FRT to disseminate images of the bodies of dead soldiers is not really about fulfilling a humanitarian obligation, that is to let families know that their relatives have died during war, but it's actually more like an act of warfare, an act of psychological warfare, where the idea is to disseminate images of dead soldiers so that families in Russia are distressed. And this is a very interesting objection, and I still need to think a little bit more about it. But I think that we could ask the question of whether Russian citizens are liable to be subject to this kind of distress, if it can be argued that it helps accelerate the end of the war. And I think there are very good arguments to say that it might be that Russian citizens might be liable in this sense. And then even if the use of FRT is not, strictly speaking, only, or its goal is not only to fulfill the humanitarian function, but also to engage in a kind of act of warfare, it might also be justified. And so that's all that I have so far. And so I think I kept my 20 minutes. And so I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Juan, for your presentation. I think it's very interesting that now we have what used to be in the movies being a threat and the usual espionage on the 007 sagas. Now we can figure out ways in which you can actually use it, and of course the objections that can be raised to the facial recognition. Well, congratulations on your paper, and thank you for sticking to the time. And so we can move now to the second paper. The second paper is, as I already mentioned, by González Fernández, Enrique Siqueiros, and José Luis Hernández Sanchez. Yes. It's called Information Revolution and Human Security, Ranges and Limits of Resorting to Ethics Through the Martens Clause in Regulating AWS. Tienen la palabra. No sé cómo está empezando a dividir tiempos, pero más o menos ahí. Adelante.
Y ya está. Thank you. First, we want to thank Professor Sandra, Juan, and of course Enrique for the former discussion of our article. and of the organization of this seminar, as well as the speakers. Today, Karen González, José Luis, and I were presenting a legal and ethical approach to autonomous weapon systems. In a broad sense, weapons are like frontiers, tools to protect national and individual security and interests. So the debate about the deployment, the development of new weapons is the current debate between the national logic and the human rights-centered one. Autonomous weapons are, in addition to a social urgency, a point of reflection and inflection for two security paradigms, the national and the humane. A similar paradox emerges with respect to human rights and borders. Weapons, like borders, exist to protect national sovereignty and, in theory, the interest of its citizens. But today, with the transnational laws that are above national sovereignty, the human rights, we see borders and weapons contradicting directly, in many cases, especially weapons, human rights. This work makes an issue of resorting to ethics as a regulation tool of autonomous weapon systems, OS, parting from the call to public consciousness contained in the Martin Clause of international law. We begin by setting forth the evolution of self-regulatory as well as legal efforts within the information revolution under the new paradigm of international human security. We then move to the challenge posed by the conceptualization of autonomous weaponry, followed by its impact on or menace to human rights. We will end by discussing the limits and ranges of such ethical, juridical, regulatory strategies regarding autonomous weapons. We conclude that although this ethical resource, the Martin Clause, means progress for a human-centered regulation of technology, it faces difficulties from the very definition of autonomous weapons and the accountability of its scope of action in a political order, and that lacks universal recognition of individual human rights. That is, that many countries, they don't support, they don't align with international humanitarian law. The technological eruption and the concentration of power brings forth unprecedented challenges for both the legal and social order. Perhaps the most extreme case in the development of intelligent weapons. Armaments develop with computational technology, which to a greater or lesser extent can perform functions independently of human control. From the Israeli Harpy munitions or the US Tomahawk anti-ship missile to the MQ-09 Reaper, an unmanned aerial vehicle. The case of autonomous weaponry is quite particular because weapons hardly have an ethical justification. Moreover, most technologies are hard to assess morally, whether it's due to their impact on political configurations or because it is its social disruptiveness. Thus, Kratzenberg's first law, technology, I quote, "Technology is neither good nor bad, nor it is neutral." However, weapon technology is designed by definition to cause harm. This is the definition in any dictionary. Something used to injure, defeat, or destroy. Today, we are witnessing new efforts of ethical integration functioning as inspiration to both soft and hard regulation and technology, from the change of a national security to a human security paradigm to the formalization of laws by the state. On the face of such menaces to human dignity, the resort to a legal precedent stands out. This is the Martin's Clause, which has historically linked ethics to jurisdiction. This legal instrument was one of the first tools devised by the international law, which in absence of positive legislations appeal directly to ethics, and I quote, "the laws of humanity and the dictates of public consciousness." Further, end of quote. Further onwards, we will elaborate this clause more specifically in and to appeal to public conscience. So now we have our friend, the lawyer, José Luis Hernández. Please, if you are with us.
Thanks. Thank you very much. First, I want to say that there are various social phenomena that deliver for the information revolution. and the regulation, or better say, the lack of regulation of new technologies. Lethal autonomous weapons systems are one of these social phenomena that require ethical revolution or legal revolution, but are necessary to generate legal improvements that protect people. The new paradigm of human security must also be an aid to exercise in request. In general, the lawyers know that the rules and ethical principles are built with human customs. Custom marks the course of ethics and law. In general, the lawyers know. Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. In general, the lawyers know that the rules and the ethical principles are built with human customs. To marks the course of ethics and law. Martin's clause and the concept of public conscience is a formula contained on international human law in ethical support. Autonomous decisions, algorithmic responsibility, digital justice, digital constitutionalism, algorithmics, and massive manipulation of decision must be studied by philosophers and lawyers together. In this essay, we join philosophers and lawyers for the analysis of the concept. I will mention two ideas of reflection. First, lethal autonomous weapons in the field of the world come out of the traditional paradigm of legal analysis and must be retrought with international human law. It seems like a contradiction, but it is not, since the use of artificial intelligence in the matter cannot be done as that happens in civil, criminal, or commercial law. The European Union has understood in the way on. For example, in all the new regulation that is being built in or artificial intelligence in the European Union uses related to military defense or where are the regulations separate. Here we are the main controversy. It removes around where the categories of responsibility and the ethical principle of international human law are sufficient to respond controversy, or their use or whether it's necessary to create new concepts. Second reflection, the United States or United Nations organization has been working on documents with ethical principles for the use of certain weapons that may be considered excessive harm. One of these guides principles remains the Martin's Clause, the law of the use of the force, the law of the prevention of the war, and the protection of non-combatants, and is other uses that value the state may have made or grant to the Martin's Clause generate problems of the application, and so is the meaning of go to her in case not covered by the legislation. Philosophers and lawyers on the issues, you must work with the creators of artificial intelligence to protect humanity.
Jimena Viveros argues that the most recent weapon systems are completely sui generis and give rise to its own de jure and de facto category. This, in turn, produces some problems, which, as Viveros herself addresses, pose important challenges to states with respect to the way these systems should be understood and regulated. As we point in the second part of this work, generally speaking, from an international perspective, it has been argued that it is possible to resort to the Martin's Clause in cases where legal resources are limited by whatever reasons. We, in fact, explicitly show how this clause is invoked to deal with the problems posed by us. Nonetheless, we will suggest here a critique of the possibility of resorting to the Martin's Clause on matters pertaining to the autonomous weapons due to the latter sui generis nature, which hinders the application of the clause. Let's recall that the key elements of the Martin's Clause are stated as follows. Populations and belligerents remain under the protection and empire of the principles of international law as they result from the usages established between civilized nations, from the laws of humanity and the requirements of the public conscience. Thus, the formulation and implementation of the clause in itself entails a number of problems already noted by several authors. In a paper called The Importance of the Martens Clause in Regulating the Use of Drones in Warfare, Ivana Maria Tocino, on the footsteps of other researchers, presents a status questionis with regards to the general problems of the definition and implementation of the Martens Clause. As a quick summation of the arguments, we can mention the following points. The principles of the laws of humanity in our refer to the fact that the Martens Clause has been incorporated into the main documents of IHL to the ends of establishing criteria for the evaluation of cases non-contemplated by positive laws. Requirements of public conscience mean projects of laws, declarations, prescriptions, etc., issued by public welfare institutions, religious communities, or highly competent organizations on the matter, which have carried out comprehensive studies on the matter, thus creating an idea about the practices compatible with the sense of humanity and those incompatible. The author also mentions specific examples of cases where the Martens Clause was invoked as if it were mandatory, as well as cases where some states did not consider it neither mandatory nor binding, such as the claims made by the United States, United Kingdom, and Russian Federation when defending the legality of nuclear weapons. We consider that the value states might grant or not to the Martens Clause is a general problem for its implementation, and so is the meaning of resorting to it in cases not contemplated by positive legislation. However, we now wish to delve into some aspects of the challenges posed by the development and use of autonomous weapons to what might be a possible solution to legislative problems attached from appealing to the Martens Clause. Number one, paradoxes within human rights objectives. To begin with, determining precisely what are autonomous weapons is already a difficult subject. Most proposals end up understanding them as systems able to become active in a somewhat independent way from humans. The U.S. Department of Defense offered the following definition. A weapon system that once activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. This includes human-supervised autonomous weapon systems that are designed to allow human operators to override operation of the weapon system, but can select and engage targets without further input after activation. As can be appreciated, this definition of autonomous weaponry includes, almost per excellence, that these systems work automatically as left in some part of its operation without human intervention. This is a starting point already problematic, since IHL underlines the importance of permanent human command over weapons. In this sense, there is at least ambiguity regarding the way human command is to be understood. Moreover, this element becomes even more difficult to evaluate because it seems desirable for the least number of human beings to be present in actual battlefields, thus reducing human life loss. Notwithstanding this end, how can it be compatible with the Martens Clause, which requires human agency in order to have accountable actions? Both ends, seeking to minimize human life loss and having responsible agents behind every weapon, are in agreement with the Martens Clause. Nonetheless, which one is to be prioritized? Another problem, second, the problem of autonomy and responsibility. The features of autonomy already inscribed in the 12,000 DoD definition of autonomous weapons are aggravated in systems employing techniques known as machine learning or deep learning. On the one hand, these systems learn while in use and develop processes invisible to the programmers who designed these tools. This means that such systems may eventually make decisions to processes unbeknownst to any human beings. The black box problem, as called in specialized philosophical literature. On the other hand, even though these systems might make decisions, autonomy, consciousness, responsibility can be attributed to them, unlike humans. Therefore, weapons themselves cannot be made accountable for whatever they might do. It is not clear at all how responsibility and autonomy are to be understood in the case of us, nor how do they relate to human responsibility and autonomy in the case of their development and usage in warfare. There is no consensus on whether the liability for the specific use of such weapons should be attributed to their manufacturer, the programmers, or the military personnel who use them. An example of the ambiguity in the chain of command and its responsibility would be to do without human decisions at any of the ODA loop moments, a cycle coined by the US Army to distinguish decision-making moments during warfare: observing, orienting, deciding, acting. Another problem is the problem of speed and uncertainty in the development of us. A problem which has arisen from the constant development of computational technologies is that it progresses extremely rapidly. Consequently, the decade elapsed since the initial OS definition was provided has seen outstanding and rapid improvements and advances in this type of weapons, a fact which contributes to problems of vagueness in its definition and the scope of its functions. There are constant improvements to extend systems, and new devices are introduced all the time. However, our capacity to explain and foresee how these new technologies might work seem incapable of keeping up with its development. Even more crucially, how can legislation tackle this problem? It may seem that traditional legal customs and instruments is not and will not be enough to sort out of the problems intrinsic to us. How to find a balance between the speed of development of these technologies and the way new legislation is made up? How can we resort to established usages, the laws of humanity, and the requirements of the public conscience regarding technology just recently appeared, not at all easy to understand by the general public, and whose practical scope remains unclear? In our opinion, the novelty of this technology, alongside the promptness by which it develops, as well as the uncertainty about its potential uses and scopes, render substantially difficult to establish exactly how the Mertens clause can be applied to it and its problems. And finally, a problem that we call the logic of might versus the logic of ethics. A problem found when trying to regulate any technology by means of ethical criteria is the existence of a logic beyond the moral sphere itself, an utilitarian logic in general, and in this particular case, current policies of national security. From the standpoint of state power, moral and humanitarian concerns are disregarded. Under such rationale, autonomous weapons can make warfare more efficient and balance state power competition, as the U.S. National Security Commission on AI report claims. World military powers, both large and small, are pursuing artificial intelligence, AI-enabled and autonomous weapon system. Such systems have the potential to help commanders make faster, better, and more relevant decisions. They will enable weapon systems to be capable of levels of performance, speed, and discrimination that exceed human capabilities. The debate amongst national powers has resolved around the later argument of begging the logic of might, the inability to stop the development of us on the face of other nations' advancements of it. As of today, no agreement has been reached, for example, to ban so-called killer robots because Russia, India, China, and the United States have doubts about the necessity of a neutrality on the development of usage on such weapons. So, some conclusions. The development of autonomous weapon systems places a considerable challenge to international politics and practical ethics. Due to legal loopholes opened by the information revolution and smart weapons, ethics reappears amidst public debates, political halls, and legislative venues. It continues to operate, nonetheless, on the basis of non-negotiable principles, thus hindering their implementation. On the other hand, international law is not, after all, a universal regulatory framework, since several countries have not signed nor ratified agreements for limiting, stopping, or banning the development of this kind of weapons. It does not seem feasible then to limit it in absolute manner, their development, notwithstanding the existence of many voices aiming at precisely that. Especially because we find ourselves facing an entirely new weapon system, unable to be understood in a similar fashion to others. Current international legislation developed with other types of weaponry in mind, therefore, turns to be inadequate to deal with these brand new technologies. Even if the Mertens clause seems to provide a space to face potential juridical problems derived from the use of these weapons, we opine that given the very peculiar nature of contemporary laws and the ambiguity of ethical concepts, the resort to the Mertens clause turns out to be quite insufficient to deal with the problems arising from us. Consequently, we think that it's important continue to institutionalize reflections, the likes of the CCW on the scope and limits of the relation between politics and ethics. For instance, the way in which the Mertens Clause may be strengthened since resorting to it or to similar instruments will remain necessary in practice. However, it is also of the utmost importance, as well as necessary and urgent, to reflect on and to produce interdisciplinary studies about these matters, thinking about the development of us and deepening our understanding of notions such as autonomy and responsibility, not to mention envisaging the scope these systems might have, can result in better legal resources to deal with them and their issues. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Karen. Well, and let me just, I was saying in the previous brief remark on the previous paper that we have the James Bond saga. Now you are into the Isaac Asimov's iRobots and duties and so on. So that's very, very interesting. So finally, for the presentation of this paper, we have Michael Blake. You are around, Mike?
Yes, I'm going to try to share my screen. Since I'm the last of the speakers, I'm getting a fair amount of feedback here. I'm going to see if I can jimmy things up. Okay, that seems better. I wanted to begin by echoing some of the thanks from the other speakers, but emphasizing that this has been an exemplary discussion. I've learned a huge amount. And also, I want to thank everyone involved for making this discussion possible and for doing the incredibly difficult task of running a hybrid discussion in such an extraordinarily productive way. Thank you to everyone. This has been wonderful. What I've done today has been to write a paper that is very much intended as a work in progress, and in fact may not even yet be a paper. It's a series of worries or questions, ultimately about tourism and its effects upon citizenship. And I wanted to start with two texts, and these are texts that I've sort of been puzzling about for a while. They're not philosophical texts, they are poetic texts, as it were. And one of them's big old-fashioned high culture of a Nobel Prize-winning poet, and the other is Britpop from the mid-1990s, but they both deal with the phenomenon of being visited in one's home and finding that home changed by the encounter. Derek Walcott from St. Lucia wrote about the experience of anxiety over the presence of outsiders who had come to dominate and subtly transform both the physical space, linguistic space, and the self-understandings of the St. Lucians that he was encountering. And it's worth just reading this poem out. The drizzle that falls now is American rain, stitching stars in the sand. My own corpuscles are changing as fast. I fear what the migrant envies. The starry pattern they make, the flag on the post office, the quality of the dirt, the fealty changing under my foot. I've always loved this poem, and it speaks to me to an anxiety over the phenomenon of being visited as a site of tourism and how that tourism can transform one. But the title of my talk is taken from the 1995 song Common People, which details, it was written by Jarvis Cocker, who had the experience of encountering a profoundly rich foreign student who wanted him to take her to all the dive bars and impoverished hangouts that he, growing up in the lower middle class, had access to. And he did this, and in a sort of very gradually increasing amount of venom, discussed the ways in which that phenomenon was a degrading form of exoticizing or othering him as a sort of sight to be experienced. And that led to the title of this paper, which is that everyone hates a tourist, especially one who thinks it's all such a laugh. And the ways in which the tourist comes in and experiences temporarily the life of an other, someone whose form of life is radically different, how that can be a disrespectful experience was something that I've been puzzling about, especially as I found out more and more about the economic centrality of tourism, especially after the pandemic starts to lift. Prior to the pandemic, a full tenth of the total world GDP, I think, was being provided in one way or another by tourism. And the question of what kind of commodity tourist services are, to my mind, hasn't gotten enough ethical attention. So if everybody hates a tourist, the first question that I wanted to ask was, why? Why are tourists so disreputable? And I found a series of books called Don't Be a Tourist, which is actually a guide for tourists as how to do tourism without looking like a tourist, which speaks both to our desire to do the things that tourists do, encounter difference, temporarily become part of another community, without showing ourselves to be doing that, which shows that we have a kind of double vision. We want to do this, but we're also, as it were, aware of some of the ethical worries that it brings with it. Now, the first reason you might think that this is a problem is a fairly simple one. Tourists tend to have money. They have the ability to take that money across boundaries of nation and culture. And that means that they're probably going to be relatively wealthy, relatively ignorant, and relatively unconstrained in how they throw that money and ignorance around. And this reminded me of the classic description of American service personnel in England during and after World War II. They were described by the British people as overpaid, oversexed, and overhere, which is a wonderfully British way of saying we cannot wait until there were fewer Americans littering the countryside. Now that's, I think, true as far as it goes, but it's not, to my mind, the real core of the ethical concerns that we might have about the phenomenon of intercultural and international tourism. I think there's actually something much more subtle going on, at least in many cases, which involves the fact that the tourist actually tends to encounter a set of industries that are set up to welcome and cater to the tourist. And this involves a sort of exchange in which the tourist brings money and presence, and what they're provided with is a kind of experience of difference. We engage in tourism because what we will see, what we will eat, what we will encounter is different than what we would get at home. And that means that there is a kind of economic exchange, difference and the novel for cash. And it might be, and I'm going to explore this, although I'm not confident about it, that there's some inequity in the allocation of the benefits and burdens of that exchange. But more relevant for the purposes of this conference, and I think actually more likely to be true, is the fact that the practice of tourism can have negative effects upon local citizenship. And I understand local citizenship here to be very much on a line with what some of the people were speaking of yesterday, the ability to speak and to be heard within the local political discourse. And when tourism starts to become a prominent part of any particular political site's economy, there can be negative effect understood both with reference to whose needs will dominate political discourse and also with reference to whose language will dominate political discourse. And I don't mean this literal language, although that can be a part of it. Instead, I understand this almost with reference towards a Wittgensteinian idea of a language game, whose particular vision of how it is that the world is to be carved up will dominate. Under circumstances of tourism, especially in tourist-heavy sites like my example, which is Hawaii, the language that is spoken is the language that is most useful for the tourist, and that can have a residue that lasts even after the tourist has gone home. So, to understand this, I want to go to Maria Lugones. And Maria Lugones is not a figure on whom I'm an expert, but many of my students have actually written on her work, and I've had to go back and actually become more familiar with it. So if I'm making a mistake, I do hope that someone will help me. But Maria Lugones seems to me to be a very powerful analysis of how it is that we can encounter deep diversity and difference in a way that captures either respect or contempt. And she describes two paradigmatic cases of encountering the other, one of which begins in arrogance and the demand that our own experience is primary, such that whatever we know or learn about the other must be translated into our form of life or made with reference to our interests. The paradigmatic case she uses is Aristotle's analysis of the slave, in which the slave is to be understood only through their aspect as tool or thing to be used by their master. The slave is not to be understood except with reference to the master's interests. And that's the sort of limit case, one might imagine, of arrogant form of perception. And the alternative to this is what she calls world traveling, which is the willingness to enter into the world of the other in a way that does not reduce that to your own world, that does not insist upon a simplification or a flattening of that world, but seeks to enter into it. And there's a lot of wonderful discussion in Lugones of the ways in which this necessarily involves the risk of appearing to be a fool, but that the playful willingness to be a fool. Sorry, there's some waving.
Yes. Michael, we missed you for some sort of internet failure a little bit. So
Yeah.
the Maria Lugones, that it's
Yeah.
you are taking it her from readings from your students, and then you start reading her and getting more familiarized with her work. I think we were pretty clear on that part, and then
Yeah.
so if you can.
Yeah. My apologies. That might be my internet. I hope not, but it does occasionally do that. I think what probably got missed then was the idea that the two limit cases of experiencing the other are an arrogant perception that essentially reduces them to what they can do for us, and that their experience is interesting only insofar as it could be translated into or made useful for us. And then the world traveling, which involves the risk of appearing to be a fool by entering into the other's world on that world's terms. And that this is where Lugones' concept of playfulness and entering into the world in a way that risks being newly made in that world is viewed as a possibility. Am I coming through at the moment? Can I? Okay, thank you. Cool. So there's two aspects of this that I think are relevant to tourism, and that's that there's actually two faces of world travel. Lugones herself tends to emphasize in much of the writing the idea that world travel is in fact a way of being open to the particularities of the other, and that is in fact a way of love. It's a loving form of perception. And here I think she echoes some of the work of Simone Weil, who at one point has this wonderful gnomic sentence that all forms of undivided attention are prayer, that to be utterly open to the reality of the other without holding back what it is that you want out of the encounter is to disappear in the face of the other, and that is that as close as we can get towards the phenomenon of praying. And that's understanding world traveling as being open to and thereby respecting or loving the other. But it's also worth noting that traveling between worlds in this way is a survival strategy for the marginalized that is costly. It requires epistemic labor by which the reactions of the powerful must be understood, must be predicted, must be accounted for. And it requires emotional labor to consistently change your own framing and language about the world to that which can be experienced through the eyes of the powerful. That's a picture, by the way, of Chris LeBron, who has a wonderful piece in the New York Times in which he discusses the ways in which white Americans in the US never have to, as it were, think about what it's like to be a black academic, whereas black academics must travel to the worlds of white academics constantly in a way of ensuring that their work, the work of the black academics, will be acceptable to and understood by and not bothersome to the white power base. So world travel can be a form of loving attention, but it can also be a hell of a hard thing to do. And it's this labor that I think is what's going to prove interesting in the context of international tourism. So to get back to that, there's a nice link between Lugones's world traveling and the more simple fact of, well, world travel. People whose job it is to welcome tourists into their communities, into their homes, not understood here as physical residence, but simply a cultural or jurisdictional site, they have to present a complex culture in particular terms, which are translated into the terms available to the tourists, which are curated so that they are rendered somewhat more comprehensible, and they are simplified because any actual place has an enormously complex history, which is often presented as a thumbnail instead to those who visit it temporarily. And I'm thinking in particular, because I live in Seattle, of the phenomenon of tourism in Hawaii. And tourism in Hawaii tends to present an utterly simplified and deracinated vision of the history of Hawaii under colonialism and after. And all of this involves a certain amount of emotional and epistemic labor on the part of those who work in the tourist industry in Hawaii. That is an enormous part of the Hawaiian economy. Now, I'm running low on time, so what I'm going to get to relatively quickly, I think, is the issue of what it is that could be wrong with such practices. There's a couple of possibilities. One that I'm ambivalent about is the idea that you might think that some forms of cultural labor are intrinsically wrongful, in which people are asked to commodify and sell their own cultural heritage in a deformed way. And there might be an analogy here with the sale of sexual or reproductive services. Satz, my old advisor, has this wonderful book, What Some Things Should Not Be for Sale. And she doesn't take precisely this line, but there is a school of thought that argues that some forms of sale are so damaging to the one selling that we ought to, in general, regard them as morally problematic at best. I'm not sure that this is actually going to survive scrutiny, but I think a more political version of this and the effects of this sale on citizenship might. I think that there's actually an enormously powerful effect upon the institutions of intercultural tourism, upon local citizenship, understood as the actual ability to be a participant freely and with a certain amount of proportional power upon the local political discourse. And there's at least two forms of this that I will go over relatively quickly. The first is economic domination. And the simple fact is those whose interests are taken most seriously will determine really the ways in which your politics, your discursive and democratic politics go. And where tourism dominates, the interests of tourists are likely to dominate the interests of the local community. And in its own odd way, this is an echo of some of the pathologies of international development. Dambisa Moyo's work tracks how the institutions of international development practices have often been to coddle or protect the epistemic interests of the developers, those who are in the world of development economics or in NGO practice. And thereby the deformation of local politics has involved African nations in particular changing themselves so as to help coddle white do-gooders with money. But I think Walcott's complaint is a more cultural one, which is that the linguistic frames we use in dealing with others, they cannot help but spill over their boundaries into the ways we understand ourselves. And I think Walcott's complaint is a sort of almost existential fear of becoming American while remaining in St. Lucia, that the ways in which he navigates the world are changing as St. Lucia's economy begins to be enmeshed with that of the United States. The ways in which we flatten our own histories in the service of welcoming others can end up flattening that histories for ourselves until we are in fact no longer quite at home in the place that we have not actually left. Now, the last thing I want to do is to say what is to be done. And this is where I think the answer is, I don't bloody well know. It seems like we have, in this case, a set of bad options. Tourism is so vitally important for economic productivity, and especially productivity in more other marginalized societies, that to say that tourism should be stopped is simultaneously unrealistic and a bad idea. To continue tourism as it is would probably enable the continuation of certain forms of injustices. And everything I've seen about how to ethically respond to this, including the ethical codes from those who are NGOs focused on international tourism, have spoken of partnerships and listening to the indigenous, which is all extremely high-sounding verbiage that ignores the structural problems that, on my view, make this such a difficult problem. So I'm going to stop here and ask for any help that might be available in making this project more cohesive or plausible. And once again, thank you to everyone involved in this seminar. It has been a wonderful experience. I only wish that I could be there with you in person. Thank you.
Yeah, we are all trying to cope with this new reality of doing things hybrid in online and in presence and at the same time. So the discussion I think will be a little bit tricky. So we have a long time. So we have till 11:30 at least. So there's plenty of room. So don't get desesperated, because I have the feeling that to get some order. And let me just add that now Michael, with his paper, he also made a lot of reference to not only to movies but to music and so on. So and get us to talk, thinking about the bad side of the tourism, which people usually don't see. But let me just to get some, if you agree, that will be my suggestion. Let's try to give 15 minutes, like to each paper first, and then we'll still have like 15 minutes to overall comments. I think that will be more easy for each one, especially if we have two people in the online as presenters. So let us try to do that. And so we can start with Juan Espíndola. And so if anyone, and I will need someone to help me with the contraseña de la computadora, ¿no tiene? No está funcionando. So to see if there are questions from here, from the internet, and from the Zoom, and I can read some of the questions if they're in the Zoom, but I will have, of course, to get people from here first. So Steve, if you want to start, yeah.
But first of all three of these papers are just great papers and work really well together, and they're all just incredibly interesting. So, but to stick to the first paper, I just had one very simple observation, which is with facial recognition technology, just as a threshold matter, how concerned should we be? So just two things occurred to me. One thing is the face is our most public thing. We present it to the world. We decorate it. It's like our least private part for one thing. So in that respect, one might think that privacy concerns about having your picture. Now that's too simple. But anyway, I'm just going to say that to start it. And then I guess the other thing would be that insofar as we're concerned about people's privacy, I guess it would be interesting to know how much concern is sort of bubbling up from below. Because I think that should be the test on how much do people care about it, I guess, after they've understood what's going on. And that might be part of the tricky part. Is there kind of informed consent implicitly going on? Those are just my two questions for the first.
Do you want to take those, Juan?
Yes, yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for those questions, Steve. I guess to respond to the first question first, how much people care about their face being out there and being used, and whether informed consent is a relevant issue for them. Well, so in the paper I'm focusing on just the case of Russia, right? And on this Russian Facebook page where most of the images are coming from. And of course, it's very difficult to know whether Russian citizens, to the extent that it's very hard to know anything about Russian citizens because of the type of political regime there. I would argue that the concerns would be similar to those in other places. No, of course, this is a very dangerous assumption to make, but there is some evidence that people in other parts of the country are not. I mean, I think that they're not aware that the information, including images that they post on Facebook, are accessible to anyone. Most of them believe that it's just friends who can see them, or so those who are friends, for instance, in Facebook, they think that only friends can see them, and they just have no idea of how accessible they are. So I think that's the conclusion. Many scholars who study this empirically is that people in general don't. So they would be upset about their images just circulating everywhere if they knew about the fact that is the case. So I mean, I would assume that something similar would be the case in Russia. And then the other thing is that it is true that so the face is our most visible. So there's no way of hiding our faces. And so every time we walk into the street, we're actually just showing our face. But it's not about, in the case of mass surveillance, it's just not it's not just merely about observation, about our face being observed. It's about being identified, so having our face identified, even if we don't want it to be identified. I mean, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that yes, our face, there's no way of hiding it, and every time we are in the public sphere, it's out there for everyone to see. But it's a different matter when we're talking about letting others, particularly authorities or officials from other nations, be able to identify it in the web, to search for it. I think that's a slightly different concern, and I don't know if that's what you mean by the threshold matter, but so I guess that's what I would say. That the problem here is not that the faces are, that the problem is that the identification of faces, so that the faces are searchable, that our faces are in the internet, and then anybody can search for them. And I don't know if this is a good response to your questions. I don't know if this is what you had in mind, but if not, please tell me.
I was just going to say, I think you're on the right track. And I think the question is sort of, what specifically is the problem? Is it more the surveillance, the ability to follow you around as a consequence of your face being recognized? Is it other things that follow from the specific uses of facial recognition technology, I guess, rather than the fact that you're being, I'm not clear about it myself. I just think try to get a little clearer about what the problem or the problems are. And it seems like they're more specific than simply the existence of facial recognition technology. Since some people have very good facial recognition and remembrance, that varies quite a lot across people, apparently. And as a general matter, that's not a problem. But so it's just a question, and I think you're thinking about the right sorts of issues.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, you're right to press me on that point, because it's about using facial recognition and more generally biometric intelligence and social media intelligence, right? So it's I guess the problem is when you couple facial recognition techniques with other forms of espionage or intelligence more generally. I guess that's when it's problematic. So in a way, so when people do social media intelligence, or people who write about social media intelligence, they rightly claim that so authorities need a justification to start prying on other people's social media, right? So officials need a justification to go into to start looking into your social media, to your Facebook page, for instance. And that's the case, even though, well, your public your page in Facebook is kind of public. Of course, you can put safeguards and you can make it private, etc. But even people who have open access, authorities still need a justification to go in there and start looking through the page with the purpose of extracting intelligence, extracting information, from it. So I think that the critical point is that what needs to be justified and what needs to be explored is when you couple facial recognition techniques with other forms of intelligence, because at the end of the day, the concern about surveillance is the ability of some agents, including the state, to pull information together, right? To integrate information. That's a concern, and in general for intelligence, and so I would say facial recognition techniques are a part of this problem. So they're one of the inputs that gets integrated and then lets authorities or other agents to profile you and get information about you and potentially interfere with your decisions, and that's the problem. So I guess that's what I would say.
I can see Michael Blake has the hand raised. So it on this point, or you would like to ask something else?
Sorry, it's something else. I can wait if need be.
I get you in the queue. So let me figure out if someone wants to say something in this part. I think Enrique Siqueiros wants to say something. I have Alex on the line and Michael Blake on the line.
Thank you, Professor Espíndola. Here's a comment and two brief questions. The facial recognition is relevant not only for espionage, as we know, but because of automation and automatic discrimination. Maybe I'm going to bring an example. But first the question, you share an example that we can call a state of exception, that is warfare. Do Fabre's and your own perspective apply only in states of exception? Because I'm not sure that this concern falls into a slippery slope fallacy. There is a strong concern that tech leaders and political authorities are able to massive data collection and storage for self-interest purposes. There's even a discussion about the imminent danger of facial recognition and tech inequality that argue for the ban of this technology because they can be a powerful source of discrimination. Maybe one of the most important examples is facial recognition technology used in Mexican and US border to surveil American migrants. So I don't know if we can, if that concern, what do you think about that in your approach and in Fabre's approach? And the second question is about the problem of forecasting and predicting to justify risks. There's a lot of literature about the limits of forecasting risk from data science. Where can we draw the line for a justifiable degree of risk so that we can justify the use of facial recognition? Who sets the criteria of an effectiveness, necessity, and proportionality? That will be my questions. Thank you again.
Juan?
Yes. So the first question was that if I mean, what I've been saying applies only to states of exception. So I think at least, I mean, obviously the case that I'm discussing does apply to, or I'm thinking about the issue of facial recognition only in this kind of state of exception, it's in the state of war. So the theory, so Cecile Fabre's theory is a broader theory, and it's supposed to apply to context of war, but also to contexts of sort of where there's so peacetime, but where there's a unjust foreign policy being conducted. So I'm only focusing on a very specific case within. So when we talk about the use of facial recognition technologies, I'm only focusing on a very, very limited context. So yes, that would be my question, because I know, and in this context, some of the usual concerns, the most prominent concerns about facial recognition technique do not apply as prominently, I would say. So for instance, it is true that in ordinary contexts, the most pressing concern about facial recognition and what makes it objectionable is the fact that there is a disproportionately distributed harm. So if facial recognition is supposed to have some benefits, but those who receive the benefits are a segment of the population, and those who receive the harms from the use of the technology are a different kind of segment. So that's been studied a lot, and that's perhaps the most serious concern about facial recognition in sort of like in democracies, or in any society that is not facing intense conflict. But I don't think that for instance, the problem of disproportionately distributed harm is not such a pressing concern in a case like Ukraine. So that's why I did not address it. So there are different kinds of issues that arise, and those are the ones that I tried to address in the presentation and in the paper. So this is just to say that I'm aware of those concerns, but I don't think they apply prominently in a case like this one. So for instance, in a context like the US, the concern is that facial recognition technology is very poor at recognizing African-American faces, but it's very good at recognizing white people. So essentially, that would be that is a very serious objection, but that it does not apply to the context, to this context, at least the one that I'm studying. But also, though it might be a problem. And then, so with respect to forecasting, so that's a very good question, and I wouldn't be. So I guess we have to make a distinction between peacetime context and context of war, because so in a context of peace, I guess so legitimate authorities would be the ones to set the effectiveness, necessity, and proportionality constraints. There has to be an authorized body who makes those calls. But of course, in a context of war, where especially in a context where there is in the context of an unjust war, when there is an unjustified aggression, then I would argue that it's up to those to the nation that's defending itself at least have some leeway in determining what those criteria are, and that's a little bit what I think is the case in Ukraine. To use again this instance, I mean, to the extent that the Ukraine is defending itself from Russian aggression, I think they have.
Thank you, Alex. You want to make a question? Yeah. Pensé que habías acabado, Juan.
I was just going to say that it's permissible for them to at least have some wiggle room to determine what those criteria are. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for these three papers. I really enjoyed them. I think my question for Juan follows up a little bit on what Enrique was asking, and I guess what I was struck by is how restrictive Fav's account and also your account seems to be. I mean, the ship on facial recognition has sailed. It's widely used in immigration enforcement. Governments around the world are scraping Facebook and its equivalents. And it almost seems to me that you're asking governments to really turn back the clock and stop doing a lot of things that are very much routine. And maybe that's fine. And I'm curious what you want to say about that. But I was also curious about espionage more generally, because it certainly isn't restricted in practice to defensive war. And so is the account that kind of routine espionage practices using big data and facial recognition, that those should be off the table and most governments should stop doing it? I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, maybe I wasn't clear enough, but I mean, actually the account, so just to talk about Cecile Faber's account first, I don't think it's restrictive. It's actually, it would allow the use of big data in many ways. Because at the end of the day, the account is if you can make the claim that the form of espionage can protect rights, and it's instrumental in protecting the rights of the citizenry. If there's just a plausible threat that's out there, and you want to avert it, then you may use espionage. It's permissible and even perhaps mandatory. I mean, that doesn't seem to me restrictive at all. It's actually quite the opposite. I think I wouldn't call the Faber's account a restrictive account. I would actually say the opposite. But then so in this context, in the context of war, I mean, I'm actually saying that this kind of use of facial recognition is actually permissible. So what I was trying to argue is that I don't think that the privacy objection has a lot of normative purchase in the context, because at the end of the day, Russian citizens are liable to be spied upon because in some way or another they have contributed to the war. At least they haven't opposed to it. And there's a discussion here about whether they are tolerating the war because they're under duress, they're in an oppressive regime, and so we can discuss a bit more about that. But the point is that so the argument was that they are liable to be spied upon. So it's again this kind of the use of this technology is not objectionable. And even with the slippery slope objection, like I said, I don't find it quite compelling. Maybe the fact that it might be normalized in the future and that there aren't sufficient institutional safeguards to keep it in check. So that's a source of concern. But even then, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm ambivalent, but I'm leaning towards more towards the idea that it may be used in this context because of in part because in this context it is so this is a context where espionage can be understood as a defensive practice, right? So maybe I didn't get that point across, but I'm actually I was trying to be sympathetic to the use of the practice. But there is a point also that and also this connects to what Enrique was saying in his question. It is undeniable that used in the context of peacetime is used when it's used in like in the US or in the UK. Facial technology, facial recognition technology is has very objectionable features. So, like I just said, it's to the extent that it does a very poor job at recognizing the faces of ethnic groups, particular ethnic groups. It's bound to make mistakes, and those mistakes are gonna. So, to the extent that facial recognition makes mistakes, it will be making more mistakes with respect to some ethnic groups, and that's problematic. And I don't think that saying that we should ban it on those grounds. Actually, Fabre argues that we should ban facial recognition on those grounds because it's just because of this problem. I think, look, it might be unavoidable. It might be facial recognition might be. Can do about it, but we can still say it's ethically questionable. I mean, I don't see why that would be a problem. So I think that's my response.
We still have Michael Blake and Enrique Camacho for questions on this, and I will try to move to the next one. So, Michael.
Okay, I have one question and one suggestion. The question is possibly just revealing my ignorance, but I'm not sure why this is espionage, which has always, to my mind, invoked a certain amount of covert activity or secrecy. Whereas if I go up to a dead body and examine its dog tag, that might be intelligence gathering, but I don't think it's espionage. And if I do the same by means of facial recognition, it's not clear to me that that is espionage. The suggestion might be that a more respectable version of the slippery slope argument might be Henry Shu's argument against torture, which is that even if there are non-rights violating cases of an institutional practice, we might still think that there are some practices government can't be trusted with because they will inevitably find ways to use them badly. I think that's probably a good argument against, institutionalization of targeted killing, assassination, maybe torture. And someone like Fabre might actually say something like that against facial recognition as well, without having that run into all the traditional problems of a slippery slope. It's more that we know government, if it does it for a good reason, will inevitably do it for a bad one as well.
Great. So thanks for that suggestion. I think it's a better way to formulate the concern that I have about the institutional qualities. If the government doesn't have institutional qualities to keep facial recognition in check, then that's a source of concern. But so I think this is a good way of a better way to put that. So thank you. And so I guess what's this. I think this would be a form of espionage, just because of the and again, this has to do with the coupling of different forms of intelligence. So the fact that you go and take a picture of the person and then so for instance, if you were to take the picture of the dead soldier and then post it on social media and say, hey, this is a fatality of the war, so come pick the body. That would not be a form of espionage. But I think the intent is to sort of try to identify those bodies and then run the search on with the help of preview AI to try to determine who that person is. Because so when you're doing that, you're surveilling the social media, right? You're sort of like trying to so it's a form of social media espionage. You're trying to determine who that person is, and then the question is, well, that's kind of so it's no question that you're violating informational privacy, but then you're trying to determine who that person is, and then if it's true that the only purpose of doing that is not to inform the families, to alert the families, but also to create some sort of like warfare, then I think we're getting closer to espionage, because espionage is not only used to obtain, to conduct covert operations. It might only be used to deceive the enemy, or to sort of like it might be used as a form of warfare. So I guess so it's not just the use of facial recognition, but again it's just the integration of all of these techniques that at least takes it close to espionage. So and that said, I agree that it's not a clear-cut case of espionage. So I guess what I'm trying to do is to say that, okay, this resembles espionage in many ways, and where it is, I think, espionage, counter-espionage, I guess, is when it comes to identifying operatives, right? In that case, it's definitely espionage, because it's counter-espionage. Okay, so yeah.
Enrique Camacho.
I'm very grateful with Juan for being so cool and supportive with us and participating in this panel. And I also worry, you were saying that the machine could perhaps include some biases from the programmer. So it might be a technical failure, that it has black blindness, but it also could be just introducing the biases of the programmer. So I think that happened at the beginning of television, that the technology was designed for white faces, and they had a lot of problems broadcasting with other skin colors. But then maybe the machine would include several other biases coming from programmers. So since these kind of machines learn, then as they learn, they will reproduce and even maybe magnify the biases of the people that program them. So if the programmer comes from a context where there is a lot of political mistrust and things like that, I cannot think in a single example, but I suppose that as the machine learn, maybe they can increase and make these biases even bigger as they interact and connect faces with biometrical information and the deepness that they use to scan our social media and so on. So maybe that's another variation of the slippery slope or some other kind of objection. Thank you very much, Juan. I'm very grateful.
Yeah. Yeah, no, quite the opposite. Thank you for when you said that there was an opening, thinking of it. I mean, the feedback I've received is great. So no, don't take me. I should be the one thanking you. But I just want to say that I mean, it's true. This is a discussion that comes up also in the context of algorithmic moderation of social media. That the machine is trying to identify what counts as harmful speech, right? And then, but then, of course, it's incorporating all of the biases of the programmer, and then for that reason, it doesn't identify harmful speech, but then it actually performs even. So it doesn't learn as well as it should, but it also learns the biases of the programmer. So and for that reason, then it doesn't moderate well. It doesn't curate well. Or also with natural process language software that they also reproduce all the biases of the programmer and then just take it to a different level, to a higher level. So all that is true. I don't know how that would be relevant in the context of facial recognitions, because in the end, so the problem, so the function of the software is to make a match, right? And so you might say that the program is poorly at matching the faces, but I don't know if it could go. It could be worse than human analysts, because you could say human analysts also make mistakes, right? They could also make mistakes in identifying people, and so just perhaps because facial recognition does it at a larger scale, then it would make more mistakes. But I don't think that in principle it would be there will be an additional. So I wouldn't be concerned about an exacerbation of the biases. That's what I'm trying to say. But I might have to think more about that, because it might be an issue.
Okay, thank you, Juan. We'll move to the second paper.
Thank you all for the comments.
Welcome. And somehow I was wondering if there's a connection between the two papers, of course. The facial recognition, and we start killing with automatic weapons someone. And now that that Enrique was saying, and also Juan was asking or mentioning the fact that of the bias of the programmers. So I have one question of my own, and then I will ask for everyone to join. You seem to be giving too much to the idea that the Martin clause requires the human agency to be accountable actions. But I think that someone has to program the automatic weapon. Someone has already built the weaponry. So the guns demands Mexico in the US seems to be like into that kind of direction. I'm sure you have something to say. And so everyone can get started in questions. You want to?
Thank you for the question. Yes, there are humans behind all weapons, all technology. The problem that we have and our main concern is automation. So you don't know, you cannot foresee all the possible outcomes when you write an algorithm. So the problem, yes, one of those is biases. Another is, I don't know, the mistakes of these computers and systems. So yes, there are human beings maybe with biases, also maybe with moral codes, but it's the automation that is our main concern, because we cannot foresee all the possible outcomes. I want to start with that. I don't know if Karen or Jose Luis, but thank you for the question.
I think that one problem one general problem with this technology is that there are a lot of words that are just vague. Autonomy, responsibility, intelligence, and there are many, and the problem is when you try to go to analyze with care what these words are about. Most of the time you can do it very well, but the problem is that in the discourse in general, there are sometimes very used in wrong ways. So the problem is that about this problem of the weapons. Everybody would agree that automatization or automatic weapons would be a better way to call them, but we still call them autonomous. And I think that in the grand scenario, this could bring problems. Thinking of the Morton's Clause that talks about laws of the humanity and good intentions. And that is one of the reasons that we want to bring this problem to the discussion. We understand that maybe there are problems of words, but we are not sure about that. I don't know if you have seen the discussion about Lambda yesterday. Yeah. And most of the engineers will say that is not a person, that is a program, and we shouldn't be talking about that. But in ordinary people, everybody is thinking that maybe there are some sentient person in there, and it's a problem that I think we cannot dimension very well the scope of all these discussions. So one is one of the reasons that we're talking about that.
So I have many questions. So I have probably to start asking to put two in pairs, or if they're related to give them an advance. So let me just have it straight. So Steve, Diego, Bernardo, and Luis, Sandra, Alexia. So it's almost everyone around the table, and we already have Juan and Michael on the Zoom. So yeah, probably let's try to wrap the responses as well. So let's do two questions or three, and then we can keep. Steve.
So I just had a very simple question, which is, so one problem is this lack of human control, the automatic nature. So, I mean, I'm trying to think of analogies, and I just don't know. So, like, I was thinking landmines and booby traps. I mean, those are set, to go off automatically when somebody steps on them or something. So, maybe are those illegal under international law? Maybe they are. Okay, so that would be an analogy. And just the other general point was, you have some remarks towards the beginning about ethics and ethics being voluntary, laws mandatory, and so on. But it sort of sounds like the Martens Clause is almost a kind of Dworkinian principle of international law, that when the rules don't apply, the principles still apply. I guess it could be kind of inclusive positivism, but that would seem to reflect the ways in which there are ethical principles in the law that have force, even when the rules of the laws are not clear. So that seems to me to represent in Dworkinian fashion a kind of merging of law and morality. So I thought some of the remarks about ethics at the beginning might be, I think I'd say ethics is mandatory. It's just that it's not always legally enforced. The sanction is the ill judgment of other people. But there is a sanction, and in that sense, it's not voluntary. You can't, anyway, yeah.
Well, in the same way, and thanks a lot for your paper. I enjoy it a lot because you make me feel so uncomfortable with the idea of public conscience. So my question is going in that direction. I know that in the paper it says that the requirement of public conscience, it's by projects of law, declarations, religions, community, etc., etc. But my problem with this is this public conscience that you're talking about is not an hegemonic public conscience that leave out minorities and could do something horrendous to in the name of humanity. So what is your definition of public conscience? Is this a hegemonic form of view, or it could be something else when we talk about public conscience?
Bernardo, una vez.
Well, I would ask you, I want to ask you if automation is your main concern because of the impossibility of foresee possible outcomes. What's the difference between that concern and the precautionary principle in any other field? For example, if we talk about genetically modified organisms, many people have concerns because the impossibility of foresee possible outcomes. So I don't see that you are working on artificial intelligence in particular. And it's a good example, the Lambda recent scandal, because Steven Pinker was saying the engineer who is so worried about Lambda doesn't understand the notion of sentient machine. So sometimes we talk about artificial intelligence, but we are not really worried about that specific characteristic. Yeah.
If you want to take this, and then we can do the other ones. So Alexia, Luis, and
Yes, first, that was one of the examples, the landmines, the personal mines, and they were banned exactly because they were not allowed in international law. And we know many stories of children walking around on them. The lack of control and the Martin Clause, yes, we see a breakthrough in the Martin Clause, and we were very excited to see ethics and legal ecosystem working together. And we see them, maybe sometimes they are very far from our Mexican legal systems because they work in this Durkheimian way. But as Karen was saying, its ambiguity is the problem, because one of the first questions that maybe we didn't address in the paper, but we can discuss about that, is yes, what do we understand when we think about public consciousness? And maybe it's the same problem with Rousseau's general will. It's like, whose will is that, okay? And of course, the problem is that people, the leading culture, the leading consciousness is the people that have more power. It's as simple as that. That's, we have to address that in the. I don't know. You want to follow up this so we can.
Well,
okay. And José Luis, if you are out there, you can also help in this. Okay, and then yes, I was with Professor Bolaño's question. Yes, sometimes I think an artificial intelligence, and I try to see the big picture about ethics of technology. So the precautory principle, I think it's different here in artificial intelligence because of the size of this technology. It's all about the size, with big data, with the concentration, the collection, and the storage of this amount of information. Maybe it seems that all technology can be applied, but the main concern, yes, is an automation, but because we have an unprecedented amount of data and an unprecedented ability, capacity to act in reality with this artificial intelligence. So yes, it's maybe in a very simple way, it's too big, too strong. So that's why there is just this tiny difference.
Okay. I think that we are dealing with some major problems. One is ethics of war. That it's always going to be a problem because it seems like very contradictory to talk about that. No? But we are installing here in the place where we assume that there have always been wars and it will be continuing wars, and that some people has to legislate about them. No? Obviously, we don't want. No, the best scenario, I think, for everybody is that there would be no weapons, but obviously that would not going to happen. So, but we assume that we are thinking of that, and in the world that we are living now, the Mertens Clause has been proposed as a good tool to think in the problems that war creates, especially when there are no legislation about some problems that happens. No? And we were thinking about that, no? that special instrument for those problems. And we related with artificial intelligence technology because we think that these are clearly insufficient with this technology. I know that, well, there are people that are defending the Mertens Clause because they say that it has been a very useful tool in problems like minas, minas and the nuclear weapons and the prohibition of these weapons has been supported for this Mertens Clause. But we think that is an insufficient resource for this specific technology. And this connects with the question of the Professor Bolaños, because I think that there's a big problem that it's not only about the weapons, like he said, it's about the technology, this technology in general. Specifically, I think that is creating a problem, for example, for our understanding of science. We are using these techniques in all the fields that you can imagine now, but there are some processes that we don't understand how they work. Nobody understands them, not even the programmers or not the engineers, no? And the problem is that we are obtaining results with these tools, and we are using them like scientific results. But what does that mean to our understanding of science? No? In philosophy of science, there are a lot of questions about that. No? If we need to know the processes where we are thinking about something or understanding something, what do we want? We want explanations, or we want predictions, or we want results. And the problem is that this technology seems that clearly cannot give us some of that things. They cannot give us explanation. That is, or in a sense, it's known that. So the problem is what we do with that. No? And the other problem, I think, is the scope, like Enrique said. And I think that it connects with your first question too, and to the other talk, because, okay, for example, no, our face is the most recognizable thing we have, but the problem is that our face can be seen in the other side of the world. And we are not sure what implications can bring. No? So there are cases, for example, that people who are unfairly accused of committing a crime, and even they say, okay, you didn't do it, no? Go and go with your life. But in the case where in the internet, for example, no, these people could have problems with their lives after that, even if they are innocent, no? Because when they go and look for a work, for example, maybe they don't be not contratar.
One card.
Okay, because they appear on the internet that they were suspicious. No? It's difficult to take them the ticket. But okay, so more or less that's it.
Okay, let me go to the guys who are in the Zoom. So we have Juan Espíndola, Michael Blake, and Jonathan Orozco, I think. So if you can go in that with your questions, and then with a second round, and then finally we'll get Luis, Alexia, and Sam.
Yeah, so thank you for the talk. I just have a few questions. So one is that I mean, if I understood correctly from the paper, you were drawing attention to the fact that assigning legal responsibility to manufacturers and programmers is very difficult because the role is very ambiguous. And I was thinking that maybe, or I don't know if you had thought about, or if anyone had thought about using international criminal law to grapple with some of these ambiguities because so in international criminal law there has been a lot written on how to that might be read here as well. So in other words, I think there are resources in international criminal law to address with some of these issues. I don't know what you think about that. Then the other question is that even if there are ambiguities in the legal sphere, the ambiguities are not as stark, I think, in the moral sphere, right? Because I think, I mean, you could make the case that even if programmers and manufacturers, I mean, they even if they don't know who will be harmed by the weapons that they're creating, or even if they say, well, look, I just built the system, I don't know who it's targeting. I mean, they still have responsibility because of what they know, right? They know that the systems are used in ways that harm innocent people, even if they don't know the details. So I think that so Christopher Kutz, in his book on complicity, he makes an argument along these lines where he thinks about the case of this scientist, Miriam, who worked for the Ministry of Defense, and who's building mines, actually, I think, or technology that I don't remember exactly the technology, but she's doing work that is then being used by the Ministry of Defense to harm innocent people. And I mean, his argument is that, I mean, he has to, I mean, Miriam cannot simply, make the disclaimer that she's not the one deciding how to use those weapons. I mean, she's building them, she's helping, she's contributing to their being built, and she has a vague idea that they're being used wrongly. So I don't know. I think that so using Christopher Kutz's framework of complicity might be helpful to think through some of these issues. And then just finally, I know this is a very complex issue, but I think it might be useful to consider some of the cases where automation is actually a positive, right? Even though I know that's sort of sounds controversial and it's maybe hard to think, but if you remember this, there was this article in the New York Times about how the Israeli army targeted a scientist from Iran who was implicated in building nuclear weapons. And so, I mean, regardless of what you think about the policy of targeted killing people who are responsible for creating weapons of mass destruction, the point I wanted to make is that when they targeted the scientist, and I don't remember his name, he was traveling in a car with his wife, and so they used automatic they use facial recognition software to target him and to spare the wife, right? So usually they would simply just blow the car and kill everyone who was in the car, right? It doesn't matter, like the people who died when who were not the scientists, that were just collateral damage, right? But now in this case, I mentioned they used automated, they used artificial intelligence to just kill the person and not kill the wife. So so it's important, I guess, to bear in mind also these positive uses of automated weapons. And that's it.
Michael.
Steve took the heart of my question, but I did want to just add to his question, because if the principle that condemns autonomous killing machines is the absence of a selected target that's selected by a human, that does seem to have some revisionary effects on international law, because anti-tank mining and naval mining are not prohibited under international law. And both of those involve creating a weapon when you are ignorant about which particular vehicle will be destroyed by that weapon, with the resultant loss of human life. So it's possible you could lean into that and endorse it. That might be a good result, but it does seem that it's not just autonomous, but also dumb weapons that could be held guilty of not having a human selected target.
Jonathan Chavez, you were also raising your actual hand on something. I'm wondering if you have a question. Jonathan? You have to open your microphone, or let me ask you if you can open it.
Que no tiene micrófono.
Okay, so you don't have a question. Don't worry, my mistake. Okay, so you can respond to these two, and then we can.
Thank you, Professor Espíndola. The question for international criminal law. I was hoping that our very best lawyer is out there and he can answer this. Because we know that international humanitarian law is aligned in many ways with international criminal law, but I don't know that. I don't know if Karen can explain this. The second is. Yes, I'm thinking that we are heading to a more evolved legal ecosystems when we can not only have nested laws that's what Professor Bolaños was talking yesterday, but also nested responsibilities. So maybe we can face and we can ask for, we can ask not only the engineers, but also the investors, also the chain of command, when there is a crime involving autonomous weapon systems. We are not there yet, because exactly we don't know who is to blame when something happens. But with the development of these legal ecosystems, now we can ask the engineer, and that's how when the engineers are coding, they are thinking about the risks. So maybe there is a way, and we are going there. And also, just about automation, we daily discuss, Karen and I, with engineers and machine learning engineers, data scientists, and it's a very enthusiastic discussion. Yes, we think automation is amazing. It's amazing just by itself and by what it can achieve to help many people. It can be more precise, as Karen was saying. It can help to measure amounts of things that we didn't imagine in the past, as the US AI International Security Agency claimed. So yes, we don't. Our main concern about automation is because its power is so big, but at the same time we are very enthusiastic of its ranges and its limits.
Yes, and well, I think that with the comments that you have made, with all of you. It appears one of the problems that we were thinking, that is that the Martens clause is ambiguous, no? Open the door to ambiguity. And someone said that there were no moral problems here, but I am not sure about that, because like some of you have said, no, one can say these weapons help to not kill many people because there are no people there. But the other side is going to say, no, these weapons are bad or are wrong always because only the states that has this kind of technology have a good position there. No? Maybe they are not going to kill a lot of people, but the other side that doesn't have this technology are going to have a lot of problems that are really wrong problems too. And there is where the problem emerges of how can anyone can say this, they have the reason or the other side has the reason. No? So that is the problem. That I think that it's important to think of the legality of everything of this, no? Because the Martens clause is appealing to a space where the law doesn't go, because no, it's something that emerges in the world, but I'm not sure that we should be happy only with that, because we know that this technology is being developed by many countries. And I think it's a challenge, a big challenge for law, no? For people who are creating the laws. And I would like to insist also in the problem of the velocity, no? Because the laws don't change with the velocity that this technology changes. And that is also a big problem in this. No?
So let's go back to Sandra. Sorry, first Luis.
Okay.
And if you can say that the whole name, because people in the they don't get to see exactly who's talking. So
Okay, so I'm Luis Javier Lopez Farhat. Thank you very much for the 3 papers. They are very interesting. It is very difficult not to agree with you. Of course, I agree with the abuse of language regarding all these technologies. But I wanted to mention something that could be very, very, very controversial, especially perhaps for people in Mexico, and perhaps not very controversial for our American colleagues. You mentioned, Enrique, in the part you read, that there is not an ethical justification for using this kind of weapons. But it's controversial because I think there is an ethical justification for using this kind of weapons. I don't agree with this, but that's a very common discussion, public discussion, for example, in the States. And of course, people who are promoting this kind of weapons, they have an ethical justification. So I want to know, what do you think about, because I think that's a very important part for your paper. You need to discuss what is going on with people who have ethical arguments, legitimate defense, or this kind of arguments that immediately come out in the discussion. So I want to know, what do you think about? I think, of course, this is a matter of limits, as is the case with Juan's papers, that the problem is how to make understand people who is working on technologies. You were mentioning that every day you work with engineers and tech people. And I think what is problematic here is how to use or how to make them understand that technology is not a bad thing. It's only an instrument, it's a tool. But the problem is how to limit the use of technology. I think that's behind your paper. but I think you should not avoid the ethical arguments that justify the use of weapons, because otherwise it's very easy, you know, to start saying, well, it's impossible to justify the use of weapons. Well, I think it is not impossible to justify the use of weapons. I think there are a lot of many good arguments that justify the use of weapons. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexia Michelle Araujo. My question, well, it's like following up of what Bernardo said, and also looking forward to artificial intelligence at this part of the algorithms. I mean, I know the Martin's clause and the automatic things that you're speaking about, but in this case, and taking again the comment of Stephen, the algorithms and the neutrality of the web, how can we perhaps introduce the basic principles to it, because we cannot regulate internet, at least in Mexico isn't regulated, United States isn't regulated. But in this case, facing the problems that you mentioned with your face or the identity that perhaps is running in the other side of the world, right? So an approach from artificial intelligence in this CAPTCHA or the big data that gets all our sensitive personal dates. And the other question, well, that's a following up and a question and an approach also. And the other question is for Michael Blake, who has spoken about how the language outlines the idea of this tourists and tourism. And perhaps if you have some time, if time gives us, to speak a little bit more about it, because I found it an interesting topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Present yourself, because people.
Yeah, I am Sandra Gomora Juarez. Thank you very much, all of you, for your papers and your presentations. All of them have been terrific. Thank you very much. And it made me think about something else, and I want to comment this and ask you if it has some relation to your topic, because I was thinking if there is a way to set a line or a kind of division between the general artificial intelligence gadgets and those that we strictly call weapons. And I was thinking that many general gadgets could be weaponized at some point, and if in some way could be related to this, to think about or how far can reach the regulation if we need to get involved in that connection, because we use these gadgets like, in a very natural way, but of course it implies some other possibilities to be used. So your paper really made me think about all these problems that the problems could be rise up, given this connection with artificial intelligence. Thank you very much.
Maybe we can start with Javier's question. Yes, maybe I was cheating a little because I was using a Kantian approach, a deontological approach to ethics. I was following Berg, and he claims that weapons somehow works as lies. So in Kant, you cannot justify lies and you cannot justify weapons. But it's a very deontological approach. And yes, of course, if we see it in an utilitarian approach, and of course it's clear in the foundations of the United States, of course, weapons can be justified in an ethical way. Yes, you got me there. Then then the limits, no, the basic principles. I was thinking about cheating. I'm sorry. Can you? Sorry.
Well, I'm going to say something about the last question. Yes, in the origin of the discussion, they were talking about lethal autonomous weapons. And there were a controversy about what lethal means. So they changed, well, the discussion eventually changed it. And now you only talk about autonomous weapons. But the problem with that was, I think, something that you were, the thing that you were, that you saw. It is very difficult to say when a thing can become a weapon and even a lethal weapon. And that is a problem, also another problem that we have here, because like you said, we used all the gadgets, but we don't know the implications of that use. And that, I think that is one of the reasons like that people who are concerned about privacy says that we should be very much careful with all of that, that they think, some of they think that the use we do of social media is completely wrong, because we are giving a lot of information that in bad scenarios, like wars or something like that, could have a lot of bad consequences for us. No? So that are some of the reasons that they say that we should be more careful with everything. No? With all the technology, we should know it better, and we should be more conscious of what we are doing with it. And this is only another llamado, a call to think a lot in all of this, because there are a lot of problems here, and I think that we need many people thinking in all of this.
Just to follow up this, and the problem of, just to point it out and leaving the table, yes, we are discussing every day, not only with engineers, but also this work is inspired by Wanda Munoz. We help Wanda, that she is discussing with an NGO in UN conventions, trying to ban these weapons. Also, the discussion is that some experts, they try to argue that maybe we just have to ban the laws, that is lethal autonomous weapon systems, but leave aside the us, that is just autonomous, but they are not lethal. So the problem sometimes is very ambiguous. And maybe the most important countries that they don't want to ban, they just add a letter and they say, well, just without this letter we can use and we can develop any other tool. And at the end, the limits, as Luis Javier was asking, the limits of these tools, no matter if those are weapons or those are just code to facial recognition to enter to a shop. Engineers now than more than ever, they are understanding those limits. But we also, as philosophers and as lawyers, we are also trying to see that technology is a good thing by itself, not only a neutral thing, because some engineer asks us, are you saying that everything that I do all day that supports my family, it's just neutral? All my effort, my creativity is just, so we're trying to get together and understand that maybe technology is good in itself, but it has limits, like Javier pointed out.
So we can move to Michael's Blake paper. I have already Alexia mentioned something, but also Alex is asking for the word, and Steve. So then Enrique. Okay. So we'll have a.
Does Michael want to respond to Alexia's question first?
I wouldn't mind hearing yours and then trying to do a response to a couple at a time, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks. This is Alex Sager. Hey, Michael, I really enjoyed this paper. I'm really glad you're working on tourism. I think it's a topic that has not been covered nearly as much as it should be. I just had a couple comments and suggestions that I hope might be helpful. As I was listening, I was kind of reminded a bit of Cynthia Enlow's book, Bananas, Beaches, and Bases. And thought that might be kind of a useful source with kind of the international politics angle. And then the other thought is I wonder if it might be helpful in the paper to break tourism down into different types of categories. And here's just a few suggestions. Resorts, which strike me as very different from something like ecotourism. Another category, which I think is quite problematic, is sex tourism. And then there are the people who try to go and not have a tourist experience. And they often, kind of have a moral high ground, but sometimes I think they're the most problematic, of the four. And I'm sure there's other categories, but it strikes me that kind of the moral valence for all of these raises different issues, and the analysis might be a little bit different. Just the other suggestion is I suspect the relationship between the tourists and the places they visit are important, and that's why I mentioned Enlow's book, because often of the military connection or the colonial connection, which so it strikes me it's actually very different. Say you or I visiting Hawaii, than say you or I visiting Paris. And so this relational aspect seems to be pretty key to think about this issue. So just some thoughts that I hope might be helpful, and I'd be curious what you think about them. Who do we have next?
So, Michael, just to say, when I saw this topic, I thought, well, Michael's given up on important topics and he's working on tourism. And I, of course, was completely wrong. I think it's a superb paper. And to me, it was quite new. And I almost think you should drop whatever else you're doing and do a short book on this. I think it's terrific. So I seemed to me there were two sorts of problems you were identifying. And the biggest set has to do with the mode of engagement, the arrogant perception versus loving perception part, and then a whole bunch of distinctions you could draw between respectful and disrespectful, attentive and inattentive, so on and so forth. So, and I think you do a nice job, but I think those are all addressable in a certain kind of way. But then you have another more general issue, which is less dwelt upon, but it seems to be the most general worry, which is a kind of flattening of differences. And that one I suspect is not addressable. And it seems like that's part of in this respect, tourism is part of a much wider set of phenomena that might be associated with something like liberal modernity. When you have commercialism and toleration and people interacting increasingly in commercial networks for mutual advantage, you are going to get certain kinds of convergence on certain basic values, which don't come without loss, but are probably on balance a positive thing. And it's something that's been said about, very broadly. I sort of wrote in a book a long time ago that liberalism has a prospect of making all the world like California, commonwealth of yuppies. And this sounds like tourism is sort of part of that. And that part I think we probably have to just put up with, as long as it's voluntary. I mean, it reminds me of Voltaire's remark about the Exchange of London, where everything is tolerated except bankruptcy, but people don't care about religious differences and other differences and so on. So it just seemed to me that last worry may be just something one needs to kind of accept as a kind of downside of what may be in other respects a generally positive set of phenomena.
Could I leap in now at this point? Would that be okay?
Okay.
All right, I'm going to go in reverse order. So, Steve, I actually teach your book on multicultural education in the policy school, and I actually, I think it's Naomi Stolzenberg's quote about making the whole world California, and I take essentially the same line you do, which is better California than mid-1990s Yugoslavia. But I think there's a distinct form of flattening that's going on here, which is that it's simultaneously the kind of postmodern flattening of the whole world as airport. There was some sort of vaguely poetic thing I saw about the airport as a symbol of modernity, where all airports are fundamentally one airport. But in fact, and this will also get into the response to Alex, I think, there are some forms of tourism that specifically cater in managed and curated forms of exoticism, in which you are going to experience precisely what you do not have access to, but it is never actually the original thing. It's an ersatz kind of representation of it that is manageable and consumable. So I think you're absolutely right. I have to distinguish the kind of flattening that I'm interested in from the simple fact that so much of the world now has the same restaurants and the same rituals and the same capitalist forms of engagement. So then to go to Alex, for the book Bananas and Bases, I'd forgotten actually I have a paper that's under, as Kit Wellman says, it's out for rejection right now. I've submitted it and it'll be rejected, but it's on the temporary labor migration and the collective unfreedom of the proletariat, and it's largely drawing on that book. I hadn't actually connected it to any of this stuff, and you're absolutely right that I should. As far as the breaking tourism down into different categories, if I do anything else with this, and maybe I will, I honestly don't know. It's good to hear that you guys think it's not dumb. I'll have to do that. I do think that there is something held in the majority of these forms of tourism that has this aspect of curatorial managing. So I grew up in Canada, where on the buses, they would advertise these Cuban resorts where you would go and you would never leave the grounds of the resort. And they actually had walls with guards preventing you from going out off the territory of the resort into Havana. And that sort of seems like a limit case of the creation of an artificial world that's staffed by actual residents of the world to which you are nominally traveling. So there is something potentially that is common even among resort tourism, ecotourism, sex tourism, and you're right, Alex, these sort of obnoxious anti-tourist, I'm not a tourist, please ignore the camera on my chest, ethos that is often held by some. And that led to the most broad question, which was the first one, which is how do I understand this link between language and tourism? And I have only found a couple of decent examples. And one of these was the example from Hawaii of the replacing of indigenous forms of place name and distance unit with the forms that would be acceptable to tourists. And that is, to use Steve's line here, it's potentially neither wholly good nor wholly bad, but I want to identify a particular sort of harm, which is the replacing of a particular form of being in the world with the consciousness of another who is visiting that world precisely to have something different in their lives. So the problem for me is that this is quite literally the first time I've ever given this paper. And at the risk of admitting too much about my habits, I wrote it at literally the last possible moment out of fear that I was going to have to show up here with nothing to say. So I'm not sure I know what I'm doing. So if there are other examples that people can think of, God bless you, I would really use them, because the ones I've come up with, the idea seems potentially right to me, but the examples are never entirely perfect. So I'll stop at that point because I'm seeing a couple of hands. So I will put my mute back on.
Thank you. So we have still here. Well, let's go to two questions on the Zoom. We have Juan Espíndola and Doug Bamford. Juan?
Yeah, thank you. So I agree with this is a great paper. When I read the title, I didn't know what to expect, but I really enjoyed the final product. And I have just a couple of comments, or just one comment that actually has to do a little bit with what you were just saying about Cuba. And so so it seems very plausible what you say to us that you know what's wrong with epistemic and emotional labor of tourist workers is that they live in a society where interests of tourists come to dominate those of locals, and where those who work as tourists no longer feel at home. So all that seems like really plausible to me. And then you were considering some of the solutions to that. And then when I heard you, I thought about a solution that was obviously, that's not the ideal solution, but that was, I think, one solution that some officials in the past came with to address these kinds of issues. And they have to do with what you were saying about Cuba. And so, which was to segregate tourism, right? So the point of segregating tourists so that locals don't see them, and that's very well captured in the book, the recent book by Leah E.P., which I'm sure you've heard of, Free, her autobiography, because she tells the story of how when she was growing up in Albania, she saw the tourists who were in the beach, and then she tells the story of how they were very exotic, and they had this weird smell to them that she could very clearly smell, and then it turned out that the smell was when he saw them in the beach, and it turned out that the smell was the lotion that they used against, because in Albania they used olive oil, and so there's a lot of discussion about that, but the point is that it's very interesting so in the book you see how local authorities are trying to explain to kids so sort of this weird process that there are foreigners coming from abroad and that they're isolated, and then you have, for instance, the teacher, like the Leaipi's teacher, who's telling them, well, yes, tourists may look happy, and they may you may think that they're having a blast, but that's just because they come from capitalist countries, and because their happiness comes from the exploitation of so all the mechanisms that local authorities found in socialist nations to make sense of the tourist industry for kids and in general for society, I guess. So I don't know if that, I think that might be useful to your project, using it, because the example of Albania, like when I read it, I thought of Cuba and of other communist nations. So it seems like a pattern that's what like communist authorities did to sort of handle the contradiction of having this tourist industry where they had stores for tourists where locals could not visit, where they couldn't buy, or the secluded resorts and everything that we know about that kind of thing. So I think that, I don't know, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that segregation was sort of like might have been a flawed solution to the problems that you're indicating, and so to that extent, it might be useful to include it. So that's my comment.
Doug Bamford.
Hi, yes, I too found this topic very interesting, and not having any preconceptions about what it might be about the paper. So also kudos for the Jarvis Cocker reference. That's, as an Englishman, that's very nice, and he's come up lots for me today because I was listening to a podcast and he was interviewed on that, and then a pulper on the radio, so he's everywhere for me today. So yeah, that's I saw your title and it immediately made me think of that, and you were actually referencing it. And some of the other questions actually I thought were really good, and the point about flattening differences, I thought put one of my thoughts very well, that cultural imperialism seems to be one of the many concerns that you're raising with your examples and your references here. But it seems like that's another issue, and so maybe something to draw. If you do a whole book, that could be part of that, yeah. Because it seems like the tourist's role in all this seems to be your focus, and I just wondered if there were other people who might be seen as having contributed to this. So maybe people who make the films about Hawaii that present this version of Hawaii, which isn't really real, and they've promulgated this, and particularly maybe the marketing board, who are then encouraging these things, and they're paid to do it, and maybe Chamber of Commerce are keen for them to do it because it'll bring the money in. I guess one question is, are other people not culpable as well as the tourists? But I do think that you're right. There's things to say about the kind of virtues of good tourism, and other people have picked up on that. So that's interesting. But yeah, I'll tell you what. For my question, I'll just focus on this issue. Does it all fall on the tourist, or are the other potential beneficiaries from tourism that are trying to make some money out of it, that are contributing to these things, are they also kind of morally culpable, or is it just a structural injustice where there's no individual responsibility?
So those are, if I could respond to those two, I think those are extremely good questions. So to start with you, Doug, if I may, the question for me, I think, might be subtly different from the issue of culpability, because I teach Iris Marion Young every year, and I still don't understand her. And I think I like her, but literally I have trouble sort of trying to figure out exactly how to wrap my Rawlsian head around some of the things she says. But I think the key for me might be not focusing on causation and culpability, but something much more like, I think Juan actually mentioned Chris Coutts, and complicity in processes that are much more widespread than your own participation. So you're absolutely right. And one of the things that leapt into my head as you were speaking was New Zealand and Lord of the Rings, and the ways in which New Zealand has transformed itself into Lord of the Rings world in some of its tourist promotions. When you fly Air New Zealand, you actually get hobbits in your in-flight safety spiel and so forth. So there's certainly a lot of agency around. One of the things that I think brought me into this as far as interests go was the thought of having to be a translator between your own form of life, your own being in the world, and that of a foreigner who wants to experience difference, but not too much, please. And so that's why the people who are on the front lines, as it were, dealing with the tourists were, to me, the natural focus. Now, of course, those people are buttressed by an army of marketers and filmmakers and Elvis Goes Hawaii, an entire history of selling a particular idea. But in a sense, the people who actually have to navigate this dual identity in which they both live in one world of language and of practice and history, and then sell a sort of subtly simplified and debased version of that for consumption as exoticized vacation. That's where I thought the interesting nature of potentially immoral harm came about. And it's not even a harm that I think is intrinsically the sort of injustice that is necessarily defeasible by policy, right? I'm almost not interested in calling it an injustice so much as a really bad thing. So you're absolutely right, but I do also want to keep a focus on the people for whom the bifurcated way of being in the world was, to me, the most interesting phenomenon. And that actually gets me to Juan's comment as well. There is something really fascinating about the segregation of tourists within little camps, but there's also something, to my mind, extremely disquieting about it. And it's not an accident that the two countries that have done this with the most success have been Cuba and North Korea, right? You can't travel to North Korea except for, I think, Koryo tours, which will make sure to give you one hell of a managed experience. And also, there's a huge amount of evidence of the amount of ideological training that the tour guides in North Korea go through to make sure that they don't believe anything they're told by their guests. The broadest response to your thought about segregation is, following on this, that I'm not sure that this actually solves the problem. And I'm also not sure that it's really something that a liberal government should regard as an acceptable way to organize its tourist industry. I'm not confident of the latter, but it does give me pause. The main thing that I'm interested in is, if you look at a country like St. Lucia, which I just know about because of reading Walcott, over 40% of their GDP comes from tourism. That means a hell of a lot of people are going to be working in these residential sites. And you have to ask yourself whether 40% of the GDP being tied up with that, does it really matter if not everyone in St. Lucia talks to tourists every day? Their way of viewing the physical landscape, the history, the culture, that will have an influence on how St. Lucian politics happens. It will, and I'm glad that Alex is still in the audience, because I kept on hearing the words domination in my head, even if I couldn't put them down on paper, because that's not me. The domination might seep out even from a physically segregated site of tourist experience, is my thought.
Thank you, Michael. So we have Enrique here. Who else? Because I have one more for my own. And sorry, I forgot and your name? Alejandro. So we can do this line. Enrique.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think it was great to hear you developing a subject that, as Alex said, is really underdeveloped. I was thinking also that some of the discussions that we had about the background oppression and problems of injustice maybe could be discussed in a less politically charged ground as tourism, and maybe transfer some knowledge to other more conflictive areas of international discussions. But maybe it is the opposite way around. I'm not sure really. But what I was thinking is that, what I found particularly interesting in your paper is how you combine or use a phenomenological account as Lugones in order to understand what is going on in tourism, and then draw some normative concerns out of that. But I think it is really nice to how you mix different perspectives, different approaches very successfully, I think. And I wonder if that shows that kind of phenomenological account of Lugones shows that the ground virtue going on is not particularly justice, but reciprocity. Because I was thinking, following your model in a very old paper of Nagel's about sexuality. I don't remember very clearly, but there Nagel uses Jean-Paul Sartre phenomenology of sexual relationships, almost in a playful way, that, to be seen and also seen, and in a very reciprocal way. And once it's about sexual perversion, the paper, now I remember. So the sexuality is perverted once you lose the reciprocity. So I wonder if what we need to deal with this kind of relationships is also to protect some kind of reciprocity, even if asymmetrical, between the tourists and the people who do the work. So maybe we should take care that the people who do the epistemical and emotional work to accommodate the tourists have the social conditions in order to protect themselves from the deleterious effects of tourism, and also be aware of how tourists could be educated and have access to better ways to be tourists. We all are tourists, so there are a lot of guides and there are a lot of prejudices that go into these books that sometimes we use to travel. I don't know. I'm just poking around but my question is how do you see playing the role, reciprocity playing the role in this argument? Thank you very much.
Karen?
Okay. Well, I was thinking that what you said remind me a little of the concept of epistemic injustice of Miranda Africa, because similar to what Maria Lugones said, and maybe it's a suggestion, maybe it's useful for you to think in those terms, but I think that in the both ways, no? Epistemic injustice is about committing injustice because of lack of knowledge, and when a tourist comes to another place, there is a lot of lack of knowledge, but from the both sides, no? And you can say very well, the both sides have particular interests, no? So in places where tourism is important as an economic activity, well, the people can make some artificial things, no? So that the tourists can be happy. And as you said, that's a problem, no? And for some examples, I was thinking in Mexico, from the movie of James Bond, they inaugurate in that movie a parade, a death parade, and in the death of the Day of the Dead, and that didn't exist here before. And now every year we have that parade in November 1, and it has become something from our culture. No? And the interesting thing is that it was completely artificial, but now I think that there are people that are becoming interested in that, and that they think that they are really an activity of our culture, no? And I think that that's very problematic. But another thing that I was thinking in the other discourses, like the colonization discourses, for example, in Mexico, we have the problem that a lot of things of our culture, it's really mixed between indigenous things and Spanish culture, for example. And when they say to the artists, I was thinking that the artistic problem, the artist has a problem with that. When they say they colonize your artist, move away of the Spanish intervention and remain only with the indigenous thing. A lot of people said, we cannot do that. If you see, for example, the dancers and the music, Veracruz dancers and all that, no? Even the Mexico, the concheros dancers, they are just instruments that became from the Spanish people. So they say, if you tell me that I need to put that away, I have nothing. So I cannot decolonize this in that way. So I think that we need to think a lot more of all those things. But it's a problem because for the tourists, we present that like our culture, but it's really a mixed thing. And the problem is that it's changing, and that we always try to put it more colorful or more, no? Because we need to have more tourism, and we think that they want that. That's a problem. And I was thinking that also that maybe it's a problem of limits too, no? It's like Barcelona, no? Now it's a city where you cannot live anymore, no? Because of the tourism. But where do the people need to put the limit, no? And who can do that? I think that maybe it's that of the problems too.
¿Cuál es su nombre?
Alejandro.
Alejandro.
Okay, hi, I'm Alejandro. I got a question for Professor Blake. How could we avoid desegregation? Because I'm suppose tourism are looking for this experience like México Mágico, because are looking for voladores de Papantla, looking for mariachi, are looking for danzón, and every Mexican cannot be a volador de Papantla. And for that reason, I got that question. Is it really necessary to eliminate this segregation, or is necessary to create a new culture where every Mexican could be a volador de Papantla maybe, or is necessary to create a new culture where we could create a new Mexico Mágico? Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question comment from the Facebook, which I'm also, sorry, I will post it to Mike as well. So you can read it there, but I will try to make something different from it. I have the feeling, and again, I'm also saying what everyone else said, that I didn't know what to expect on the paper, but then I got carried away on the many issues that I think you can brought from here. And I have the feeling that the question, the common question from Facebook, touched this kind of ambivalent. It didn't get where you were talking about against tourism or against the people receiving the tourists. So, but again, it has to be, I think that's one of the points, which is that it goes both ways. The tourist and the people going to receiving the tourism. So somehow my own personal song, which I take part of your idea of the poems, the music, and the whole reference, to give a broader context beyond the idea of qualitative and quantitative research, because you also throw some data here on the importance of tourism. Somehow, the song I can came with is the erasure, the love to hate you. I think, I see, you hate, or we can hate all disrespectful tourists who come and make something which is only like party around. And we can enjoy people coming and wanted to, even though everyone is not expected to be a lot of Papantla, which we're really interested in getting the cultures and the traditions right away. So let me just throw another hint on how I think you can develop the ideas on the paper. I think the idea of the sex tourism will give you some answers. The ecotourism will give you another ones. I can throw the example of marijuana tourism, which is now debating in Uruguay. They were first for their own consumption. Now they are discussing whether to open. Because then again, we can bring tourism. We can get some of the riches of the overpaids. And yeah, I was telling him that's one of the reasons I keep bringing him here, because he's overpaid. So I guess that's pretty much the idea I had in mind. I enjoy it very much. I have problems with airports, and let me bring one good example and one bad one. The cross-border express in the border between Tijuana and San Diego is amazing. And if you have the global entries and if you have all these QRs and so on, you go through in 20 minutes in the other side. So it's really good, really amazing. But on the other hand, you go to, for instance, Cancun Airport. Already Cancun is not Mexico, but Cancun Airport is, you already feel that you're already in the US. So like, at what time I cross the border? I don't get it. But so just to throw two quick ideas on how to expand the ideas on the paper, and congratulations again.
Thank you. I want to leap in because I think there are 4 extremely powerful sets of questions here, and I'm starting to feel my brain fall out of my head. So to start in reverse order, the person on Facebook asked whether this was against tourism or against the people who were helping the tourists, or against tourists. That's as I understand the question. Increasingly, I'm starting to think that a lot of politics isn't about justice, but about tragedy, and the thought that there is not a possible world in which all goods are instantiated simultaneously, and that maybe the pathway towards greater economic equality, greater development, the siphoning away of overpaid people's wages goes through patterns of relationship that themselves are likely to encode disrespect. And that's ultimately where I think I come down, which is that there is something that's intrinsically going to pressure people towards disrespectful forms of relationship that might nonetheless not be easily avoidable in any world that we are likely to be able to live in. And I think maybe the Cancun airport which you describe as being like Cancun is not Mexico, that phenomenon is, again, an extreme case of what I'm speaking about, which is that it's possible for entire places to exist as commodities to be sold to those who want to have participated in that place. And my wife is from Las Vegas. I got married in Las Vegas, and there's an entire background Las Vegas that exists to service people who visit Las Vegas. One of the things that always bothered me about flying home to see in-laws was that everyone else on the plane is drunk, no matter what time of day it is, because they're going to a party, whereas I'm going often because someone's died. And that sort of dislocation, I think, might be at the heart of it. And there is, I think, something of the erasure, love to hate you in this, but there's also something about, I have a reason to both love and hate you. And that's the structure phenomenologically that makes things interesting. The previous question was about, how can we avoid this disaggregation? Is it necessary to create a new culture? Does every Mexican person have to be identical in sort of their performative Mexicanness? I think the answer can't be yes, because that's a demand for a particular form of performance. And I'm very ignorant about a great many things in the world and a great many places. And that's why I can't, with any degree of respect, speak about what it is to be a member of a foreign cultural community. But I am aware that when other people's money is purchasing a sort of vicarious experience of membership in that society, there is pressure on a great many people to build a simplified Mexico, which includes tropes that are sometimes more appealing to outsiders than insiders. I grew up in Canada, and we would get stories of people coming up in the summer asking where the ski hills are, and are there any igloos around? And the answer is no. It's just Toronto. Open Google sometime, right? The fact of ignorance coupled with a sort of demand for performance is at the heart, I think, of what I'm worried about. Now, what was the name of, there's a woman in a red sweater to the right of the chair in person who asked about...
Karen was with one of the presenters on the preview.
My apologies, because I thought those were really, really good. I just want to make sure I cite you. The example, first off, of epistemic injustice, especially hermeneutic injustice, that's, I think, what I'm going to use going forward, because I have a separate book that I'm writing on the politics of the ascription of meaning to lives, that I'm trying to make the case that the question of whether a life is meaningful or not is actually a political question, not a moral one. And I'm using some of Miranda Fricker's stuff on hermeneutics for that, but I think I have to use it here as well. So you're absolutely right. And then the example of the parade inspector, which I remember hearing that was a Day of the Dead celebration that was not authentic, whatever the word authentic might mean, except that it was so much fun that now it's done every year in full recognition of the fact that its origin is in one of the less successful Bond films. I think what that shows is that the simple cut I'm making, which is that the people who are staying at home and being visited by wealthy folks from abroad, that they have a fair amount of agency that I should not present myself as overlooking, of to how to play with and change their traditions and to adopt and speak back and so forth. I'm worried about a structural form of pressure towards a particular form of commodification and flattening that won't always work. And I think the idea of playfully taking what's best from the outsider and then in part mocking them is, I think, a good one. I also have to say that the phenomena you mentioned about the mixture between the indigenous and the European descended aspects of Mexican culture. I had a grad student who for 8 years tried to write a dissertation on that before giving up and writing on genocide because he thought that was easier. And he was right. He actually just accepted a tenure track job last month, which makes me happy. But I remember being at Epcot Center in Florida, which presents the ultimate flattened view of a variety of countries. And I was going through the pavilion for Mexico, and I was live tweeting it to my grad student or sending him photographs of the ways in which this presented a particular vision of Mexico that was completely abstracting away from those complex colonial origins towards a particular vision of Mexico as the not US in terms of its foodstuffs, affection for color, musical tastes, and so forth. What was taken as important was not dissimilar from what you might have seen in Cancun, except of course that no one was drunk. And that, I think, was a demonstration that it's possible to have nested structures of pressure towards homogenization. Inside Mexican society, not that I am in any sense an expert, there's an internal dialectic about how to understand the relative impacts of indigeneity versus European conquest. And then from the outside, all of that gets ignored in favor of a story that is a different kind of oversimplification. And then the final thing, Enrique, I think the notion of Nagel using Sartre, I haven't read it and I need to. That sounds great. I mean, it doesn't, because I know Nagel will be a little bit snotty about Sartre. But I think the idea of using phenomenology as a way of grounding moral thought is what I'm sort of trying to do. And I think the notion of reciprocity is something I have to look at. But for me, I think it's the moral attitude that undergirds reciprocity, which is something like recognition of the other as a like in dignity, which gets you towards reciprocity, but is distinct from it. I mean, Iris Murdoch's analysis of looking at the other and seeing, and Simone Weil's idea of attention, these are things that can ground reciprocity, but are not yet identical with reciprocity. So I think that's where I would end up. So that's where I'll stop for now.
Perfect. Congratulations, Michael. So let me please join me in a round of applause to our terrific 3 papers panel. And let me add, before giving the floor to someone else, a sense of great recognition to the people who are behind the screens, doing everything possible. So thank you for all the support. It has been terrific also to get, and being this hybrid format, it was clearly done because of you are able to help us from your different points. And so please, another round of applause for them. And before sending the floor to Sandra and to Enrique, I guess they deserve another round of applause because they put this terrific conference panels, and I think we all have benefited a lot. I was saying on the lunch yesterday that I was very happy because everyone was like making you think out of the box. All the papers were like talking on very different ideas and not getting like the same traditional discussions. So pushing the discussion to other limits, probably even erasing borders and so on. I think Alex will be happy with that. But of course, Sandra and Enrique, you have the word to close the seminar.
Thank you very much, Imer. And I want to thank to all of you for sharing with us, to be very generous to us and taking the time to discuss and interchange ideas and accepting this invitation and this challenge. It was very illuminating for everyone here in the room and in Zoom as well. So thank you very much for joining us and share part of your work with us. I want to invite you as well to visit our website, Problema website, and be checking for the result of all the efforts of this seminar, and as well remind you that we will have another discussion session in the evening. We will be talking about the book of Alex Sager here, Against Borders, Why the World Needs Free Movement of People. So everybody is invited. And I want to thank to Enrique Camacho for making this possible as well. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
I will just echo Sandra's message. I'm really grateful. I was workshop organized in Bergen before this. Thankfully, once Michael and Steve very quickly accepted to participate, I thought everything will be right, and then very soon Alex and Doc also agree. So I was really blessed by their generosity, and also behind this effort is also our work in progress seminar, which is called POLETH, Political, Legal, and Ethical Theories. I mentioned this because we had a lot of people at Zoom and Facebook and YouTube platforms. So the invitation for all of you guys who joined us there is that you also join the discussion permanently, the work in progress seminar that itself, who is also there, and I coordinate, is open to students, professionals, policymakers, everyone who is interested in political theory, legal theory, moral theory is joined to discuss. We often have projects that end up in publications, of course, but mainly we are just interested in discuss with each other and incubate or make papers, work in progress grow in a very horizontal way. So please next time don't be strangers and be in the YouTube or the Zoom. Just come here to work with us. And I also want to say thank you. I neglected last time to thank our founder fathers, as Sandra said, Imer and Juan Vega, who were also founders of Problema, but they were really instrumental for this to happen. They facilitate the financial capacity to bring you guys all together here. So I'm really blessed, thankful that this was possible, and let's keep the conversation open, of course. Thank you very much to everyone.
So I just wanted to, I'm just about to leave, but I wanted to once again just thank everyone involved in setting up this conversation. On a more personal note, this is, I think, the first time I've actually done anything substantive with new ideas for entirely too long, given the hellscape that the past couple of years have been. So thank you. It's good to know that there are still conversations to be had. So I'm very grateful to the organizers in particular. And with that, I think I'm going to go and try and take care of some kids for a while. So
we're also very grateful, Michael. And let me just ask something to reinforce the stereotypes. Do you still have your hockey jerseys in your office?
I have entirely too many hockey jerseys, but once Zoom started, I stopped having them in the background where they could be seen by undergraduates. So it may not look respectable back here, but it's more respectable than it was.